Hey everyone, welcome back. Quick thanks to the patrons who keep this channel alive. Your requests are what I narrate next. If you want to join them, you can try Patreon free for 7 days, then it's starting with just $3 a month. Links in the description. Now, let's get into the story.
A young Asian man stood staring at surroundings he didn't recognize, and had been staring at them for some time. So I've crossed over. Brian was less than delighted about it. He wasn't from this world. A day ago he'd arrived here and become an obscure watchmaker. Brian Kent. That was his name now. Had it been merely a crossing, he'd have accepted it gladly and spared himself the irritation. The trouble was that this world was not a peaceful one. It was a Marvel world, with mutants about to walk onto the stage of history. As for how Brian knew that, the reason was simple. Brian was a mutant himself. Whether it came as a traveler's compensation or had belonged to the body's original owner, he had no idea. Either way, the moment he arrived, his mutant ability had woken with him. That ability, to see through the operating principles of anything. It was identical, so far as he could tell, to the power of the ability-stealing killer from a television series he'd once watched. Whether it was a superhuman power or a mechanism so intricate it made the head ache, Brian could master it at a glance. And more alarming still, once he understood how a given ability worked, his own genes adjusted to accommodate it, and the ability became his. In short, by observing the operating principles of a mutant power in someone's brain, Brian could acquire that power. And because of the particular nature of seeing through the principles of anything, whatever he acquired came out optimized and improved, rather in the manner of Apocalypse enhancing a mutant's gift. Maximum grade on arrival. And usable immediately and instinctively, with no training at all, as naturally as his own hand. Having a template like that was some consolation. He still couldn't be happy about it. The template was extraordinarily powerful. It also guaranteed that the mutant community would fear his existence, and that his road would consist of hunting mutants indefinitely. Brian could already see where it ended, himself as the same sort of bogeyman, something mutants dreaded and might well unite against. He'd stand outside their community as its natural predator. An ability like this makes an enemy of the entire world. He shook his head, laughed at himself a little, and stood up, and his eyes hardened. And in that moment something in him settled, let 10,000 men stand in the way, I'll go anyway. It was a mutant ability, after all. Who resists that? Brian certainly couldn't. And as long as he wanted them, he could have every power he'd ever daydreamed about. The price was simply never being accepted by his own kind. Only that. He glanced at the calendar, which read 1962 plainly enough. As a traveler he knew exactly what 1962 meant, the mutants' first great confrontation. This was the year the young Magneto and Professor X came to know one another, and stood together against the Hellfire Club Sebastian Shaw. The first confrontation. Then I can fish in troubled water, use Professor X's machine to locate powerful mutants for me. Knowing where he stood in the timeline, Brian had his plan already. Join the X-Men. Professor X had only just assembled, use their mutant detection machine to find promising mutants, and quietly take what they had. Though before joining the X-Men, there was one thing he needed first. A mutant ability of his own. The template gave Brian the potential to reach Omega level. But until he'd taken someone else's power, he was very nearly indistinguishable from an ordinary man. That was the template's limitation. If he wanted to be a powerful mutant, there was exactly one road. Take other mutants' abilities. His mind made up, Brian wasted no more time. He picked up a plain watch from his own shop and held it to his ear. Tick. Tick. Damaged as the thing obviously was, he could hear the parts moving inside it. And in that moment Brian felt as though he were standing inside an enormous, intricate mechanism, countless components performing their complicated motions in front of him. Complicated as it was, it looked perfectly simple to him. There. That's what's broken. 1 second of listening had found the fault. He opened the case, adjusted a single part, and closed it again, and a watch that had been broken was whole. That was his ability at work. He needed only to look at a mechanism to understand its principles and master them instantly, and by listening to a machine run, he could pick out the one small disharmony in the sound of it. Not only watches. Anything with a mechanism in it. Brian fastened the watch onto his left wrist, straightened clothes that had seen better days, and took a Colt M1911 out of the desk drawer. He tucked the pistol inside his coat and picked up his tool bag. Everything ready, Brian set out on his first hunt. Out on the street he looked over a city that was prosperous and, by his standards, distinctly behind the times, and touched the watch on his wrist. I hope I'm lucky. 1 or 2 of my own kind would do. He flagged down a taxi, praying quietly. For the moment, wandering New York in hope of running into a mutant was the only method he had. It amounted to searching a haystack for a needle, and it was the best he could think of. He was, after all, an ordinary man with no powers at all. The template, at the outset, was undeniably feeble. Sir, you've been round Brooklyn 3 times now. Do you want to keep going? In a taxi on the Brooklyn streets, the driver was watching the young Asian man in his back seat by way of the mirror, with an expression that said he'd formed opinions. Just drive. The voice from the back seat was flat and cold, and something cold touched the back of the driver's head, a pressure he recognized immediately. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and stopped asking questions. Is my luck really this bad? Brian put the pistol away, mildly annoyed, and stared out at the crowds without seeing them. 10 hours he'd been circling Brooklyn. For 10 hours he'd made a point of walking into the busiest crowd he could find at every stop, waiting for his power to sound a warning. And it never had, which was making him want to tear his hair. Since the template awoke in him, Brian's ability had come with a detection sense. In the presence of another mutant, it produced a sound in his head like machinery turning over. Tick, tick. Anywhere a mutant stood nearby, he'd know. 10 hours around Brooklyn and not one signal. Which meant exactly one thing. In 10 hours he hadn't come within reach of a single mutant. Are there really so few of them in 1962? Complaining inwardly, he had the driver pull over, got out, and waved him off. The fare he had no intention of paying. The driver waited until he was safely down the street before rolling down his window to say what he thought of the whole transaction, at which Brian raised the pistol and put a burst into the air over the roof, and the man floored it and was gone. Having vented something, Brian felt considerably better. 10 wasted hours had settled one thing for him: he needed to join the professor's group. Sometimes one has to make use of other people's resources. A green taxi pulled up in front of him just as he was weighing whether to abandon the hunt entirely. Sir. Need a cab? The young man behind the wheel wound the window down and gave him a professional smile. And Brian smiled back, brilliantly. Because as the driver spoke, the sound of turning machinery rang through his head, sweet as anything he'd ever heard. Tick. Tick. He looked the driver over, opened the door and dropped into the front passenger seat. Hey, you'd be more comfortable in the back, friend. Oh, and I'm Darwin. Brian's smile widened at the name. He'd found one of his own kind. And more than that, he knew this man. A minor figure from the coming clash, one of the ones who doesn't survive it. Darwin. Hello, Darwin. Good to meet you. He stayed exactly where he was. You can call me Sera. A man's identity, when he's out in the world, is whatever he says it is. Brian had no intention of giving Darwin his real name. When he was hunting, he had one name only. Sera. Darwin gave him a slightly odd look. Never mind it. Can you take me around Brooklyn? Sure, the customer's always right. Though, sir, are you certain that's what you want? Hearing the destination, Darwin's first thought was of the fare. He didn't much care why anyone would want to circle Brooklyn, if the man could pay, Darwin would happily drive him round New York entire. Quite certain. Drive. Seeing the doubt about his ability to settle the bill, Brian produced his wallet, which was comfortably full of notes. A man who owned his own watch shop in Brooklyn was solidly middle class, the money meant nothing to him. Darwin didn't hesitate another second. He put his foot down, and they began to circle Brooklyn. They talked as they drove. What surprised Darwin was how much this passenger had to say, enough to leave him struggling to keep up. And in the course of it, Darwin learned that the man called Sera was a professor of genetic mutation. Brian was, of course, nothing of the sort. But a professional title, delivered confidently to a man with no particular reason to doubt it, does most of the work by itself. Darwin, do you believe the world is changing? Brian glanced across at him, and let the words carry weight. A small number of people are having their genes mutate. They're gaining abilities. They are, without question, the ones God favors. It landed, and Darwin was briefly at a loss. Abilities. God's favorites. He kept his eyes on the road and stopped seeing it. Since his own ability had woken, Darwin had thought of it as a curse. He'd never dared show it to anyone. He was afraid of what people would call him, freak, and worse. Which was why a man who could survive nearly anything was an anonymous cab driver. Brian's framing, gift, favored, did something to him. Professor Sera. Have you ever actually found someone with an ability? He turned to look at his passenger, and there was hope in it. He'd spent years hiding, and the loneliness of it had worn a groove in him. He badly wanted to find others. I have, Darwin. Why do you imagine I'm telling you any of this? Brian turned in his seat and met his eyes, entirely serious, and let a small laugh into his voice. Darwin. You're one of God's favorites. Professor. Darwin's foot came off the accelerator and the taxi lurched to a stop. Easy. I've been watching you for some time. You don't have to pretend with me. As I said, you're favored. An evolutionary step. A pioneer. One of humanity's heroes. You should be showing what you can do, not burying it. You should be up there shining like something out of a comic. Not driving a cab. Brian said it slowly, and filled it with admiration. For a man who had never in his life been the object of anyone's attention, it went in like a needle. I could be a hero. Darwin looked at him, half-dazed. You could, Darwin. That ability of yours will make you a star. Brian answered without a flicker of doubt. Professor, what do I do? The word hero had done its work. Darwin was looking at him with something burning behind his eyes. He'd already decided this man was his teacher. And he's taken it whole. Watching him swallow the hook, Brian kept his satisfaction entirely to himself. Darwin, the first thing you have to do is let the ability out. Stop hiding it. Coney Island. A green taxi sat quietly by the water. The two of them leaned against it, smoking, looking out over the bay and talking easily. And they were talking easily. In the course of an hour Brian had built himself convincingly into a geneticist searching for mutants, and in that same hour he'd made Darwin believe in him. Believe that Sera was his teacher. The mentor who would make a hero of him. It hadn't been difficult. The mutants of this era were, as a rule, lost and hungry to be recognized. They were frightened that being known would earn them the words freak and monster, and they were desperate to understand what was happening inside them. Which is why, when Brian offered Darwin the language of glory, Darwin walked straight into it. Everyone carries some version of a hero's dream. A man like Darwin carries it harder than most. Let it out. Under Brian's encouraging gaze, Darwin drew a long breath. He wanted to show Professor Sera what he could do. He wanted to be a hero. Mutation and glory. There was real fire in his eyes now. He said the phrase Brian had given him, low, like an oath, then walked to the edge of the water and jumped straight in. As he went under, gills opened along both cheeks, working steadily, and Darwin breathed underwater without difficulty. "Professor, this is it." He surfaced, visibly excited. "I call it survival of the fittest. My body adapts to whatever surrounds it and grows whatever it needs." As he came out of the water, Brian watched the gills recede and vanish. "An excellent ability, Darwin. The best I've seen." He said it warmly, and gave him a thumbs up, and he wasn't lying. In sheer potential, Darwin's adaptation outstripped nearly everyone Brian could name, up to the very top of the scale. An ability that adapts to any extreme and grows whatever survives it is, functionally, unbreakable. Developed properly, a man like Darwin could be thrown into open space and evolve a way to feed on cosmic radiation. And an ability like that had been squandered entirely. Darwin would go to his death a first-tier mutant who had never developed any of it. A waste of something irreplaceable. Which settled the last of Brian's hesitation about killing him and taking it. Before that, though, he needed to know where the limits of Darwin's adaptation currently sat. Which was the whole reason for the trust building. Even weak and undeveloped, a man who adapts to lethal conditions takes some killing. "Darwin. Do you mind if I run some tests on your body?" "Of course not, Professor." Darwin agreed readily, believing every word he'd been told. The persuasion techniques Brian had picked up in his previous life were, it had to be said, still working perfectly well. Darwin couldn't wait to be a superhero. Brian went back to the taxi and collected his tool bag from the passenger seat, a complete set of watchmaker's tools. He took out a fine, sharp blade, walked back, and gave Darwin a nod. Then he opened the artery in Darwin's right arm. Or tried to. The instant the edge touched him, the skin over the arm hardened into something like tanned leather, and the blade didn't leave so much as a line. Only then did Darwin react at all, staring at him, because the movement had been far too fast and far too practiced. It hadn't looked like a professor's hand at all. Note: a blade to the artery is unambiguously lethal, and is registered by the subject's body as an extreme environment. Adaptation triggers, the skin evolves to the density of hide. Brian ignored his expression entirely and began recording data with every appearance of professional seriousness. Which was, in itself, enough to make Darwin fall back into obeying him. What followed took some hours. Fire, the body entered its adaptive state instantly and produced resistance to heat. A collision with the taxi, the flesh went to stone in the same moment and absorbed the impact entirely. A round from the M1911 into the heart, the body metallized, and the bullet failed to penetrate. Any attack that would kill, Brian found, produced the corresponding counter. And through repetition he found something else: the adaptation wasn't fixed. Burned once, Darwin's skin grew heat-resistant. Burned a second time, the skin absorbed the flame instead. Eventually, though, Brian found the limits. First, the trigger requires a genuine extreme. A blade drawn shallowly across a finger produces nothing at all. Second, and this was the important one, the body adapts to one extreme at a time. Put simply, in water, he grows gills and breathes. Put burning fuel on that same water, and the adaptation does not stack. He will not develop resistance to the fire. He will burn. However unbreakable the ability might one day become, Darwin remained a first-tier mutant who had never trained a day of it. Which gave Brian his opening. "Darwin. It's time you contributed the first ability to me." Knowing where the seam was, he saw no reason to waste more of the afternoon. In his head, the machinery started turning over again. After all this time, his first hunt. Night, on the shore at Coney Island. Brian and Darwin sat on the ground going over the day's results, eating fish Darwin had caught out of the bay. Hours of testing had made Darwin trust him completely. It might have been imagination, but he kept feeling that the adaptation had grown stronger across the course of it, faint, but there. Growth. Which was more than enough to leave him grateful to the young professor. "Professor, I feel wonderful. My body's adapted to the dark on its own. I've got night vision." Darwin shared it almost shyly. He'd never had that before, never once, in all the years before he met Sera, had the dark produced anything in him. And now it had. There was no question in his mind who was responsible. "You've gained night vision, you say?" Something cold and interested came into Brian's eyes as he looked at him, a hunter watching an animal. "Yes, Professor." Darwin, delighted, noticed none of it. His eyes had taken on a faint shine, and the night had turned as clear as afternoon. More than that, his sight had sharpened generally, catching every shift of light around him. He could see the fish moving under the surface of the bay. And then, at the edge of his vision, he saw that Brian was pointing a gun at him. "Professor?" He turned, baffled. "Relax, Darwin. It's a small test, that's all." Brian said it smiling. "The ability is too strong. If this doesn't kill him, I want room to retreat." Then he pulled the trigger, and kept pulling it until the magazine was empty. Why isn't it working?" Darwin looked down at his own chest, honestly bewildered, as the blood came out of it. He didn't understand why the adaptation hadn't triggered. Then he went down. His heart and lungs were destroyed, and he still didn't die. The adaptation engaged passively and set about the damage, cells accelerating toward repair, the ruined heart beginning to knit, a new organ forming inside him to take in oxygen. Remarkable. He's still not dead. Brian walked over, watched the body working to save itself, and then raised the gun again and shot the new organ apart. "Sera, why?" Only then did Darwin understand that it had been deliberate. There's no such thing as unprovoked kindness, Darwin. Everything has a price marked on it somewhere, whether or not you were shown the tag. The answer left Darwin furious, and by then he hadn't the strength left to speak. All he could do was hope the adaptation would find him a way out. It wouldn't. Brian took a blade from his pocket, crouched down, and opened the skull. He'd come prepared for it, it took very little time. And with the brain exposed, the sound started again in his head, machinery turning, and beneath it a finer noise, like small parts meshing. There it is. Let's see how it runs. He crouched closer and studied it. Under his ability, Darwin's brain resolved itself into discrete functional regions, each one corresponding to some system of the body, memory, motor control, language, and the rest. A minute later, he found the seat of the ability. So that's how it works. Seeing through the operating principles of anything meant that a moment's understanding gave him the whole of it. Tick. Tick. His own brain began working like a mechanism. His body adjusted itself, region by region, something being installed. In a moment, it was his. Brian stood and took stock of the changes. His eyes were shining now, pupils contracting and settling as they adjusted, and the dark had turned to daylight around him. The adaptation had produced night vision the instant he acquired it. He walked to the water's edge and jumped in. The moment he was under, gills opened on both sides of his neck. Fins grew along his limbs, and gold scales came up across his skin. He looked, briefly, like something out of a sailor's story. A slight push of his arms and he shot through the water faster than any fish in the bay. That was the template's real horror, whatever it took, it optimized. Whatever he acquired arrived already refined to its best form, and ready to use as naturally as his own hands. Which was why, having taken Darwin's ability, Brian's own classification had jumped straight to the 5th tier. An ordinary man with no powers at all had become a 5th-tier mutant in a single night. Under the water, he closed his fists slowly. He could feel his body still changing, still adapting. Not merely surviving conditions but evolving for them, and it wouldn't stop until it had made him the ideal organism for wherever he happened to be. I don't believe anything can kill me now. Except time. He came up out of the water and onto the shore, and every adapted organ receded and vanished as he went. A pity. Out of the extreme, it goes. He looked back at Darwin, who was dying and, remarkably, still not dead. Whatever else was true, the adaptation had given the man an extraordinary hold on life. "I'll make better use of it than you did. Rest easy." Brian raised the gun and put a round through the seat of the ability, precisely, destroying it. Darwin's eyes stayed open. There was nothing further for him to adapt to. Number 233, Brooklyn. A low two-story building. This was Brian's house, the only thing his parents had left him besides the watch shop. In the ground floor sitting room, he stood with a coffee in one hand and an old lighter in the other, and set his blood-stained clothes alight without particular ceremony. The fire went up fast, and in a moment it had enveloped him entirely. Brian felt nothing worth mentioning. His body was already adapting. Within seconds, flesh and blood had become something silver and metallic, a figure out of a comic book, standing in the middle of his own sitting room while his clothes burned. When the flames died he was flesh again, without a mark on him. That was a fifth-tier ability, adaptive evolution. Brian could adapt to any extreme. A house fire was nothing, drop him on the surface of a star and he'd very likely walk away from it. Nor was it only fire. In the 2 hours since he'd got home he'd tested the ability comprehensively. His body was now proof against cold, heat, electricity, radiation, poison, disease, physical impact and energy alike. By his own testing it even produced a degree of mental resistance. Short of immunity to age, what he had was close to the deathless constitution of the Titan. And unlike Darwin's first-tier version, which handled a single extreme at a time, adaptive evolution at the fifth tier could answer several complex extremes simultaneously. Which left him with very nearly no weaknesses at all. The one thing that troubled him was that the ability was passive. He couldn't direct it, and the shape each adaptation took was essentially random. He would have to work with whatever his body decided to become. A fifth-tier mutant. Brian took stock of himself and smiled. Yesterday he'd been an unknown with nothing. One day later he stood at the top of the classification, level with Xavier and Lencher themselves. Though at this point on the timeline, the only fifth-tier mutant walking around is Shaw. Xavier's fourth. Lencher's third. He drank some coffee and began working out what came next. The first great clash was only just beginning. Charles Xavier had recently become a university professor. Eric Lencher was hunting Sebastian Shaw across the world, the Hellfire Club's Black King, the man who had made him what he was. And Shaw, the sole fifth-tier mutant of the era, was deliberately steering the great powers toward a third world war, meaning to bathe the planet in nuclear fire and wake the X gene sleeping in humanity. He intended to make a mutant world by force. Come to think of it, my body should manage a nuclear detonation perfectly well. Brian touched his chin, working through it. Another advantage of adaptive evolution, then, he could take a nuclear blast. Which put him in company with almost nobody in this world. Having recalled the shape of the coming conflict, he also knew how to get himself onto Xavier's team. The simplest route was to go directly to Oxford, where Xavier had recently taken up a post in genetics. A few questions in the right places would find him. Pass the telepathic assessment and one joins the team as a matter of course. Except that Brian, who had murdered one of his own kind the previous night, would not be passing any telepathic assessment. Xavier at this point in his life had not yet acquired his later scruples about entering minds uninvited. On the contrary, he used the ability freely and without much conscience. He read the whole of Lencher's memory within moments of meeting him, and used telepathy to make him abandon his pursuit of Shaw on the spot. Brian had no intention of letting anyone browse his memories. Adaptive evolution conferred some mental resistance. Whether it was enough to hold against a telepath of Xavier's caliber, he had no idea. So before making contact with Xavier, he needed to be certain his adaptation could withstand a psychic attack. He tapped the table with his fingers and settled on his next objective. Moira MacTaggart. The CIA agent working the fringes of the case. In the sequence of events as Brian remembered it, the whole affair began when MacTaggart discovered mutants operating inside the Hellfire Club in Las Vegas, which was what sent her to Charles Xavier for help. And if he wanted to reach MacTaggart, the place to do it was the Hellfire Club itself. Brian checked the time. 8:15 in the morning, with a direct flight to Las Vegas due out shortly. Target chosen, he wasted no more of the day. He packed a small bag, took his papers and the M1911, and stepped out onto the second-floor balcony. He looked down at the ground below, and jumped. He hit hard, and stood up unharmed. As he fell, the soles of his feet had adapted into something like a cat's pads, and absorbed the whole of the impact. Adaptive evolution might be poor at winning fights. For staying alive, there was very little in this world to match it. Brian flagged down a taxi and had himself driven to the airport. Half an hour later he boarded a flight for Las Vegas, Nevada. The first clash. I'm on my way. Las Vegas, Nevada. The entertainment capital of the world. A genuine pit of money. Every kind of venue that existed anywhere existed here, casinos on every corner, and the trade that ran in their shadow. A paradise for men. And at this moment, inside the Hellfire Club. Outside one of the luxury private rooms, a line of girls stood waiting in barely anything at all. They were the club's paid dancers. On an ordinary night their job was to entertain the government officials and politicians who came here to unwind. Tonight, not one of them spared those officials a glance. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the door in front of them, burning. They looked like pilgrims waiting at a shrine. Next. A low, resonant male voice carried out from inside the room. The door swung open, and a girl came out clinging to the frame for support. Brian, you really are incredible. She glanced back over her shoulder every 3 steps. She clearly did not want to leave. 100. He actually did it, Brian actually hit 100. The moment she was gone the waiting girls broke into excited noise, shoving to claim the next spot. A few of them came to blows over it. The entire Hellfire Club hall descended into chaos. Inside the room, Brian lay stretched out on the bed, drinking coffee at his leisure. 3 days had passed since he arrived at the Hellfire Club. For 3 days he had been searching for Agent Moira. He had found nothing. So Brian had settled for enjoying himself here while he waited for her to surface. And he had to admit it, the Hellfire Club really was a man's paradise. As long as you had money, there was no service you couldn't have. Brian had adapted to the local customs and was living like Homelander. Do whatever I want. Nobody's going to stop me. Somewhere in the middle of all that company, Brian had discovered another absolute advantage of adaptive evolution. He adapted perfectly to any woman. It was, quite simply, the power men dreamed of. Rubber fruit, rubber man, none of it held a candle to Brian. With this ability he never needed to rest. 3 days had been enough to reach 100. To these girls, Brian had become something close to a god. Buzz. Just as the girls outside were tearing into each other, an invisible psychic force rolled over them. The girl who had been shouting a second ago went blank. Every one of them stopped at once, as if someone had hit a freeze button. Click. Click. At the exact moment the girls froze, Brian, inside the room, heard mechanical gears clicking inside his own mind. He rolled off the bed and was upright in an instant. This was his mutant ability at work, seeing through the operating laws of all things, and being warned by them. There's a mutant nearby. Right outside the door. He had barely finished the thought when the door was pushed open. A blonde woman in a white pleated skirt filled the doorway. She was like ripe fruit, all allure and charm, wrapped in the poise of European aristocracy. Her figure was something else entirely. And by the standards of a man who had just worked his way through 100 women, she was a genuine stunner. The White Queen. Emma Frost. Brian named her the instant he saw her. This was the White Queen of the Hellfire Club, Emma Frost. A level 4 psychic mutant. You know me? Emma had only just stepped inside, and hearing her own name stopped her short. Then she looked him over with real interest. She had come because word had reached her that a mysterious, formidable man had turned up at the club. A man who had half the women in the Hellfire Club losing their minds over him. 3 days in and he had already reached 100, and every woman who came out of that room came out completely satisfied. Satisfied in body and in mind both. That was what had made Emma, as a woman, genuinely curious about this mysterious man named Brian. If the rumors were true, if Brian could give any woman the ultimate experience, then the White Queen wanted to find out for herself. Which was why, while Sebastian Shaw was busy preparing to receive Colonel Hendry, the representative of the American military, Emma had carved time out of her schedule and come to Brian instead. What surprised her was that the Asian man standing in front of her had just said her mutant codename out loud. Her curiosity sharpened. The White Queen, Emma. Level 4 psychic mutant. You have 2 abilities. One is telepathy. The other is your diamond form. Meeting her gaze head-on, Brian laid out her powers without a flicker. The elegant smile went out of Emma's face as he spoke. A mutant. She studied him carefully. She was certain now, Brian was one of her own kind. That certainty put her on guard. She raised her right hand and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Telepathy unfurled. And the instant she reached in to read his consciousness, a piercing sound tore through her own skull. It cut straight across her telepathy. She couldn't catch a single one of his thoughts, couldn't establish any link to his mind at all. Emma's telepathy failed. Psychic shielding. She frowned, genuinely caught off guard. Watching her wince, Brian smiled. She had it exactly right. The moment his mind came under attack, his brain had evolved a shield for it. It now released a specific mental frequency, constantly. That frequency worked like a jammer, cutting across her mind reading at every attempt. With it running, not just Emma, even Professor X sitting at Cerebro wouldn't be able to read a thought out of him. That settles that. Brian had planned to test his mental resistance from the second Emma walked in. After all, Emma and Professor X thought nothing alike. Even if she had pulled the whole memory of him killing Darwin straight out of his head, she wouldn't have raised the alarm and come at him for it. That was the convenience of dealing with a villain. Which was exactly why he had deliberately exposed himself as a mutant and recited her file back to her, to bait her into using telepathy on him. And it had worked. Adaptive evolution was proving extremely effective. Even an attack on the psychic level, it adapted to, and evolved a counter for. Under Emma's wary stare, Brian walked toward her, 1 step at a time. As he closed the distance, her body shifted into diamond. The refracted light made her more dazzling, not less. Emma, sweetheart. Want to try my mutant ability? He looked over that crystalline body with open heat, smiling. And what is your ability? She asked, curious. I can adapt to any woman. Including you, in that diamond body. Something in Emma's chest stirred at that. Really? She lifted the edge of his bathrobe with 1 finger, and her eyes went wide. In front of her, part of Brian's flesh had turned, in an instant, to gleaming diamond. Brian, this is incredible. God clearly has favorites. Struck by the sight of it, Emma threw both arms around him, exclaiming. Emma, sweetheart. I'm going to make this a night you never forget. 4 hours later. The White Queen walked out of Brian's room on unsteady legs. Brian had promised her something unforgettable, and he had delivered. Over those 4 hours the 2 of them had worked through every method they could think of. And because Emma had 2 physical states. She had experienced all of it twice over, in two different bodies, in a way no ordinary woman could. Two entirely different kinds of pleasure. Nothing in her life had prepared her for it. On top of that, Emma was a level 4 psychic mutant. She could step back into her own memory whenever she liked and live those 4 hours again from the inside. Body and mind, both at once. It left Emma feeling like she had been carried straight up to heaven. And it carved Brian's mark into the deepest layer of her mind. From this moment on, the Hellfire Club's White Queen would never forget Brian. Unless it was with him, no other man was ever going to hold her interest again. Inside the room, Brian looked over the wreckage they had left behind, smiling. Emma in her normal state was soft and beguiling. Emma in Diamond was wild, and could take absolutely anything. Between the two of them it had turned into something genuinely unhinged, more than 10 variations run through, some of which don't turn up even in the sort of films nobody admits to watching. All of which was only possible because Brian adapts to anything. Any other man would be halfway to a hospital bed by now. Ha! That was one hell of a session. Brian dressed, pulled a cigar from his pocket, lit it, and let out a slow plume of smoke, thoroughly at ease. He had satisfied the White Queen in body and in mind. Now it was time to get down to business. Find CIA agent Moira MacTaggart. Then get himself onto Professor X's team of gifted youngsters. Brian stepped out of the room, and every girl he passed watched him go with burning eyes. Having hit the 100 mark, Brian was now a celebrity inside the Hellfire Club. And not just among the dancers, congressmen and senior officials knew the name too. Hey, Brian. You're a monster. What's the secret? That's the guy who hit 100. Fine, he's got the stamina, but he had to be good looking on top of it. Damn it. Out on the floor, the men who knew him kept raising their glasses in his direction. A few sidled up quietly to ask what exactly the secret to his stamina was. Secret? You lot are just weak. I was born gifted. Brian said it lightly, with the whole room watching. Oh, screw you. A circle of hopeful men took immediate offense and cursed him out. Brian ignored them, whistled, and walked out of the Hellfire Club. 10 at night already? He raised his left hand and checked his watch. The session with Emma had run so long that night had fallen without him noticing. He swept his eyes over the street, and then locked onto a black Lincoln. The truth was that back in the room, he had folded the question into their games and let Emma turn up Agent Moira's location for him. Right now, Moira MacTaggart was sitting in that black Lincoln with her CIA partner, logging the movements of certain Hellfire Club members. Brian walked into the darkness, and in the dark his body adapted on its own to a new ability. This time he did not simply gain night vision. The darkness drove his skin to evolve rapidly, until it began drinking in the light around it. His body merged with the night completely, like one of those featureless black culprits in Detective Conan. He could hide himself perfectly in shadow. Unless he chose to speak, a person could stand face to face with him and see nothing at all. Under a light, all that surfaced was a human outline. He walked slowly up to the window of the black Lincoln and knocked on the glass. Knock. 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 Inside the Lincoln, CIA agent James and CIA agent Moira MacTaggart had been watching the Hellfire Club entrance intently, noting down every politician and official who went in or out. The sudden knock startled them both. Moira reacted first. She pulled her clothes open to sell the impression that they were nothing but a couple parked in the dark, then signaled to James beside her. James nodded and cracked the window open an inch. Moira looked out through the gap and found nobody there. All she could see was thick, unbroken night. She stared for a beat, then signaled James to put every window down. With them open she turned her head, scanning in every direction. Still nobody. Moira frowned. James. Lights. Looking at the dark closed in around the car, Moira made exactly the right call. James hit the headlights the moment she said it. Click. But the instant the lights came on, the driver's door was hauled open. Before James could react, something drove his head into the steering wheel with brutal force. He went out with a single muffled grunt. Shit. Moira swore at the sight of her unconscious partner, ripped her pistol out of her jacket and leveled the muzzle at the driver's seat. And then her eyes went wide. No way. What the hell is that, a walking shadow? She stared at the driver's seat, refusing to believe what she was seeing. There was a human silhouette made of pure darkness sitting in it. Like a shadow that had been given a body, only the eyes and the mouth showing white, and both of them looking rather surprised. Moira had never encountered anything remotely like it, and for a moment she simply froze. The figure in the driver's seat who had knocked James out was, of course, Brian. With the headlights on, light was falling across his body, and a human outline was slowly surfacing out of the black. Seeing Moira frozen there, Brian raised both hands, very cooperatively. Agent Moira. Don't be alarmed, I don't mean you any harm. Brian's easy tone did a great deal to settle her, and her thoughts came back online. Who are you? What do you want? And why did you attack my partner? Moira gripped the gun in both hands, the muzzle never leaving him, and demanded it loudly. Agent Moira. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Brian Kent, and I'm a mutant. I've come to propose a partnership. I'm sorry about your partner. That was purely self-protection. You're the only CIA agent I trust. Brian apologized with every appearance of regret, but what he actually said made Moira's frown deepen. Mutant? It was the first time she had heard the word. She looked blankly at the black silhouette of his body, with no idea what a mutant was supposed to be. Think of us as a branch of humanity whose genes have evolved further, and who have abilities as a result. We call ourselves mutants. Brian laid out the concept in a few clean sentences. Even with the explanation, Moira's grasp of it stayed hazy at best. And in any case, mutants interested her far less than what this man actually wanted. Mr. Kent. What is this cooperation you mentioned? And why come to me? Faced with her suspicion, Brian delivered the line he had prepared long before. The Hellfire Club's Black King, Sebastian Shaw, killed Darwin. There was pain and hatred packed into his voice, and Moira began to guess at the rest. Darwin? She asked anyway. Yes. Darwin. He was a mutant too. He was my brother. My family. The person I loved most in the world. And Shaw killed him without a flicker of hesitation. As his brother, I intend to put Shaw down with my own hands and avenge him. But on my own strength, I can't touch Shaw. Not a chance. So I came to you. Agent Moira. Darkness, in front of the black Lincoln. Brian, still in his shadow form, was leaning against the headlights. Beside him stood Moira, watching him with undisguised wariness. Who is this Black King you keep mentioning? Moira frowned as she asked it. The Black King runs the Hellfire Club. His name is Sebastian Shaw. Black King is his title among mutants. Brian held nothing back, whatever he knew, he said. It was, in fact, exactly how he intended to earn Moira's trust. Sincerity is always the winning move. It's the foundation everything else gets built on. Sebastian Shaw is a mutant. Moira had been tracking the Hellfire Club for a long time, and hearing this put a crease in her forehead. If what Brian said was true, if Sebastian Shaw really was a mutant, then as a CIA agent she would have to take this up the chain immediately. Yes, Agent Moira. And Shaw isn't just a mutant. He's the only level 5 mutant on the planet. Moira's frown deepened. Is a level 5 mutant strong? Moira had no idea how mutants were classified, so level 5 meant nothing to her. A level 5 mutant can already shrug off most conventional weapons. And Shaw specifically can take a nuclear strike and walk away from it. Brian wasn't exaggerating Shaw's ability in the slightest. It was simply the truth. Shaw possessed an Omega-level mutant ability that absorbed every form of energy. Nuclear blast energy and nuclear radiation included. As long as the input stayed under the ceiling of what he could absorb, nothing would kill him. Going by the events of X-Men, First Class, Shaw could absorb the output of an entire nuclear reactor without difficulty, which said everything about whether he could survive a bomb. But that ceiling was real. Push past it, and Shaw's body would overload, rupture, and kill him. God, a level 5 mutant is that strong. Learning that Shaw could take a nuclear bomb left Moira genuinely shaken. And at the same time, she understood why Brian had come looking for her in the first place. Shaw was simply too powerful for anything else. Mr. Kent. What level of mutant are you, and what's your ability? And why do you want to work with me? Brian's sincerity gambit had done its job. Moira had extended him a first, provisional trust. Moira, you can see it for yourself. I'm only a level 3. The ability I awakened is called survival of the fittest. I adapt to certain environments. Like right now, this shadow form is my body adapting to the dark. Brian shrugged, let her take a good look at the shadow, and went on. And the reason I came to you is Darwin's ability. My brother Darwin was a level 4 precognitive mutant. He could see the future. That was Brian's plan, turn a dead man into a rare precog. With that in place, he could hand over everything he knew about how the plot unfolded, whenever he liked. Darwin was dead, after all. There was nobody left to contradict him. Brian said Darwin was a level 4 precognitive, so Darwin was a level 4 precognitive. He simply didn't have the time right now. If he had, he'd have written the whole of First Class down in advance and produced it as evidence of Darwin's foresight. He could see the future. Moira stared at him, plainly struggling to believe it. Yes. Darwin was a prophet. 3 months ago he foresaw a nuclear catastrophe on a scale the world has never seen. The Hellfire Club's Black King, Shaw, is maneuvering the American military into deploying nuclear weapons in Cuba. Once Shaw's plan is complete, nuclear war becomes unavoidable, and mankind walks into a nuclear disaster with no precedent in history. My brother saw that future. All of it. Which is why he went to stop it alone. But a precog isn't a fighter. Against the Hellfire Club's mutants he never stood a chance. Before he went after Shaw, Darwin wrote down every major event he had foreseen and gave the record to me. And you, Moira, you're the person who sets the first of those events in motion. In Darwin's account, you're decent, you're brave, and you can be trusted. That's why I came to you. Under cover of Darwin's supposed foresight, Brian handed Moira the plot he already knew. Hearing that Shaw meant to trigger a nuclear war turned Moira's stomach over. Naturally, she wasn't about to take a stranger's word for any of it. She needed verification. I need to confirm this for myself. Moira drew a long breath, steadied herself, and said it evenly. Of course, Moira. You'll get your confirmation. Darwin predicted all of it. Tonight you'll come into important information, and after that you'll trust me enough. Brian nodded, stepped closer, and delivered it with total sincerity. If we're working together, you can show me your face. Looking at the man who was still nothing but a human outline, Moira said it with an edge of irritation. The truth is my ability has flaws. I can't switch it off at will, my body adapts to whatever surrounded whether I want it to or not. And when it's adapting for survival, it produces an urge to reproduce that I can't control. That last part was an outright lie. He told it for 2 reasons. One was to invent a defect in his own ability and bring Moira's guard down. The other was that he wanted her, and had decided he was going to have her. Editor's note, Bridge. The Raw chapter stages a sexual assault here. Brian strips Moira while she's still processing what he said, throws her to the ground, and the scene runs before she can react. I've carried the plot facts across but haven't written it as a scene. Every beat that matters downstream, the lie, the assault, the 2 hours, her forgiveness, her return to work, is preserved below. Details in my notes. Forgive me, Moira. She had no time to answer. Brian put her on the ground, and what followed happened without her consent. 2 hours later. Brian, back in his own body, got to his feet and looked down at her with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry, Moira. Moira was pulling her clothes back on. When she heard him she looked up at his face, and what was in her eyes was complicated. Looking at you like this, you are very handsome. If it's a defect in your ability, then I forgive you, Brian. And besides, it felt good. I'm satisfied. So stop beating yourself up over it. Moira forgave him without much hesitation at all. Not only because he was handsome, but because it was an experience she wasn't going to forget for the rest of her life. All right. Now let's go confirm what you told me, Brian. Dressed again, Moira turned back into the capable CIA agent she had been an hour ago. She turned her eyes toward the Hellfire Club. While Moira had been occupied with Brian, at the front of the Hellfire Club the White Queen was receiving several senior American officials. Colonel Hendry. I'm Emma Frost, Sebastian Shaw's partner. Emma introduced herself with perfect elegance to the evening's guest of honor. Where's Shaw? Why isn't he here himself? Hendry looked her over, wariness written across his face. Relax a little, Colonel. You'll see Shaw. Emma's focus sharpened for the briefest moment, and her telepathy smoothed the suspicion straight out of him. You're right, Miss Frost. I should relax a little. Hendry's expression loosened, and he walked into the Hellfire Club without another word. Watching a scene he knew by heart, Brian smiled. The plot had started. Outside the Hellfire Club. Moira came back with a sour look on her face. She had watched Colonel Hendry, the representative of the American military, walk into the Hellfire Club, and she had tried to follow him in. But the top club in Las Vegas ran on memberships. And a CIA agent's salary did not stretch to a Hellfire Club membership. So they had stopped her at the door. As for what happened in the original story, slipping in disguised as one of the dancers. Not a chance. This was Shaw's home ground. Walking in that easily was never going to happen. Not with a psychic like the White Queen in the building. Come on, Moira. I'll take you in. Watching her come back empty-handed, Brian smiled. Time to show off. He took her right hand and walked her straight up to the door of the Hellfire Club. Mr. Kent. Please, go right in. The security guard's face lit up with something close to reverence the moment he saw Brian, and he escorted him inside personally. Brian's fame for hitting the 100 mark wasn't nearly enough to explain that kind of fawning. The real reason was that Brian was now a permanent member of the Hellfire Club. A gift from the White Queen. Getting in that easily made Moira eye him with fresh suspicion. Brian took his time explaining. Moira, you've experienced this yourself, my ability adapts to fit. Men aren't the only people who come here. Some ladies come looking for a good time too. And I happen to be able to give those ladies exactly what they're after. The membership was a very generous gift from a very beautiful woman. Moira rolled her eyes at him with open contempt. She didn't doubt a word of it, though. Because it was true. He really could give a woman the ultimate satisfaction. Brian, go make yourself useful and pull everyone's attention. I'm going after Hendry, he's gone into one of the private rooms. Once they were inside, Moira gave the order and melted into the crowd. Brian obeyed without a moment's hesitation. Ladies. Your god is back. Brian threw his arms wide like a king returning from conquest. And every girl out on the floor abandoned her dance partner mid-step and threw herself at him. Oh my god, Brian's here. Brian's back, This time I'm finding out what the 100 mark tastes like, and not one of you is beating me to it. Within seconds Brian had vanished into a crowd of beautiful women. Moira, scanning for Hendry, caught sight of the scene, raised an eyebrow, and gave Brian a thumbs up. Then, with the skill of a seasoned agent, she located the private room Hendry had gone into, found the hidden catch, and slipped into the concealed room behind it. The moment she was inside, Moira heard voices coming from behind a bookshelf. She moved closer and, through the gap between the shelves, got a view of the reception room on the other side. In that reception room, Sebastian Shaw sat at his ease in front of the sofa, swirling a wine glass. The White Queen stood beside him. "Colonel Hendry. I need you to place the Jupiter missiles in Cuba." Shaw glanced across at the man opposite him and said it without hurry. "Christ, Shaw. You're out of your mind. You want me to be the man who damns the entire human race? If that's what this is, then our arrangement ends here." Hendry was on his feet, face dark with anger. He had a deal with Shaw, but he was not about to become the man who started the Third World War for it. Shaw watched him stand, smiled, and made a small gesture to Riptide at his side. Riptide rose, expression cold, and lifted both hands. Two tornadoes spun up in his palms, small at first and then not small at all, and then he threw them across the table. "Holy hell, Shaw, what did you put in my drink?" Hendry stared at the tornadoes tearing across the room in front of him, thoroughly lost. He'd decided he must have been dosed with something that caused hallucinations. Then the wind picked him up and slammed him into the wall. "Colonel Hendry. You have exactly two options now. Do as I tell you and place the Jupiter missiles in Cuba. Or die." Shaw stood, wine glass still in hand, and looked down at the man on the floor with those two choices and nothing else. "What are you?" Hendry, collapsed against the wall, stared up at him in horror and shouted it. "Exactly what you see. We're mutants. We are what humanity evolves into. Colonel, this world is about to change in ways it has never changed before. Human beings, creatures as primitive as you, will evolve inside a nuclear fire, and become what we are." Shaw laid out his grand design without the slightest hesitation. And behind the bookshelf, Moira understood in an instant that everything Brian had told her was true. Shaw wasn't just a mutant. His goal really was to start a nuclear war. "Brian wasn't lying to me. He can be trusted." Moira drew a slow breath and kept watching. As the White Queen brought her telepathy to bear, the terrified Hendry stopped being able to hold out at all. "Shaw, our arrangement continues. I'll carry out your orders, and I'll carry them out well." Hendry surrendered without further argument. Weighed against his own life, damning the human race barely registered. And besides, if what Shaw said was true, then perhaps once the nuclear war broke out he would evolve too, and awaken a mutant ability of his own. In which case he wouldn't be a criminal at all. He'd be the Messiah who ushered in the age of mutants. A genuine hero. "Emma." Shaw showed no reaction whatsoever to the surrender. He simply turned his head toward the White Queen. At his signal, Emma sent her telepathy into Hendry's mind. Then she gave Shaw a small nod. Only once he was certain the surrender was genuine did Shaw smile and reach down to pull Hendry to his feet. "Welcome to the Hellfire Club, Colonel Hendry. The summit is about to begin. Emma, notify Azazel. Have him deliver the colonel to the summit." At Shaw's order the White Queen let out a short whistle, and red mist bloomed into existence beside her. The Hellfire Club's Level 4 mutant. The Red Devil, Azazel. His teleportation could cover half the planet in a step. Under Moira's stunned gaze, Azazel took hold of Colonel Hendry and vanished with him. "Shaw. A rat got in." With everything settled, the White Queen glanced toward Moira's hiding place and said it lightly. "Who?" Shaw frowned. "A CIA agent. Emma put her right hand to her temple and pulled Moira's information out of her without effort. Emma. Deal with her. His plan was on the verge of completion, which had put Shaw in an excellent mood, so an intruder didn't merit his attention. One CIA agent. Emma could handle it. Azazel. Take me to Cuba. Shaw had no interest in Moira. What he cared about was the nuclear war getting off to a clean start. Bang. Red mist bloomed a second time. Inside it, Azazel gripped Shaw's shoulder, and the two of them were gone. In the whole of the Hellfire Club, only the level 4 psychic, Emma, was left. In the hidden room. Moira's mouth hung open, still reeling from the mutants she had just watched. Compared to Brian's shadow form, which seemed more of a support ability than anything else. The Hellfire Club's mutants had powers that looked genuinely formidable. Riptide's tornadoes. The Red Devil's teleportation. Even the White Queen's telepathy and her diamond form. Every one of them monstrously strong. And now Moira finally understood, completely, why Brian had come to her for cooperation. I'm getting out of here. I need to take Shaw's intelligence and his plan straight to the top of the CIA. Shaw had vanished, so there was nothing keeping her. Moira turned to leave. But just as she moved, a voice spoke inside her head. Moira MacTaggart. The voice came from nowhere and it frightened her. Who's there? While Moira was still casting around for the source, the bookshelf in front of her swung open, and Emma stepped out. It's you. The psychic. The instant Moira laid eyes on her, she understood that the voice in her head had been Emma's telepathy. As a CIA agent, Moira's reflexes were excellent. The moment she saw Emma, she drew her weapon and fired. Bang. 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 Flat gunshots cracked through the small private room. Facing a mutant of that caliber, Moira emptied the magazine without a second's hesitation. Ding. 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 Emma responded to the gunfire by turning her body to diamond, almost casually. The glittering diamond skin stopped every round. Fuck this. Moira took one look at that diamond body, swore, turned, and ran. Stop. She hadn't made it 5 steps before Emma's voice landed in her mind again. That psychic voice carried the weight of an absolute command, and Moira's consciousness obeyed it without any say in the matter. Her body was still mid-stride, and then it simply stopped. When Moira came back to herself, she realized with horror that her mind had been cut loose from her body. She had no control over it at all. She couldn't even speak. Come here. Emma's voice sounded inside her again, and Moira turned and walked toward her. Emma watched her come with cold eyes. Telepathy isn't only for reading minds and breaking into them. It can also make any conscious creature obey the telepath's instructions. It can even wipe a person's consciousness out entirely, at the level of the mind itself. But one CIA agent wasn't worth the energy it would cost Emma to erase her. Point the gun at yourself. Against an Emma who could do exactly as she pleased, Moira had no capacity to resist. She reloaded the pistol mechanically, raised her right hand, and put the muzzle to her own temple. Pull the trigger. Emma gave the last order. Moira's eyes were full of terror and despair, and the index finger of her right hand began, slowly, to squeeze. And just as Moira was certain she was about to die, an arm shot out from behind her and caught the gun. The man who had blocked it was Brian. He had followed the sound of the shots the instant Moira first fired on Emma, and traced them to this room. He had arrived to find her about to put a bullet in her own head under Emma's control. There was no version of this where Brian let Moira die. He still needed her to vouch for him if he wanted Professor X's trust. Bang. A flat gunshot. The round went into Brian's palm, and his adaptive evolution triggered passively, the skin of his right hand turning to metal in an instant. The bullet did him no harm at all. Only then did Moira come back to her senses. She looked at Brian with open gratitude. He had saved her life, and whatever doubts she still had about him were gone. In that moment Brian's standing in her mind climbed sharply. He was a mutant ally she could trust. Seeing that approval in her eyes, Brian smiled. The effort had been worth it. Then he looked up at Emma and gave her a nod. Emma. Thank you for sparing Moira's life. Emma returned an elegant smile. Brian. Are you seriously going to make an enemy of Shaw? Emma was a psychic, and she had already read Moira's memories. Which was how she knew exactly what Moira was to Brian. And it was because of that unforgettable evening with Brian that Emma had not killed her. Otherwise, a level 4 psychic of Emma's power. One CIA agent would not have required anything this elaborate. The truth was that Emma had been waiting for Brian. She wanted to ask about the level 4 mutant she'd seen in Moira's memory. Darwin. Because in any world, precogs are vanishingly rare. Yes, Emma. You know why. Shaw killed Darwin, my mutant brother. Brian shrugged and lied through his teeth. Emma frowned slightly. The Hellfire Club's mutants weren't Shaw's subordinates, they were collaborators who had banded together for mutual protection. Which meant Emma had no way of knowing whether Shaw really had killed a mutant named Darwin. Not that she cared. What she cared about was the future Brian had mentioned. She wanted to know whether Shaw's plan would actually work. Would humanity after the nuclear fire really enter the age of mutants, the way Shaw promised? What does the future Darwin predicted look like? Emma asked it with something close to dread. The only reason she followed Shaw was the future he'd painted for her. Shaw wanted to build a world with nothing in it but mutants. Which was why Emma, a mutant herself, had thrown in with him. A catastrophe. A catastrophe for humans and mutants both. The radiation from the blasts can activate the mutant gene in humans, that much is true. But the same radiation will also kill off the mutants of the world. Out of everyone alive, 3 mutants survive. 3. This time, Brian wasn't lying. Shaw was simply paying the price for not knowing any better. He had badly miscalculated what nuclear radiation does to a human body. Or perhaps, because of his own ability, he had subconsciously stopped taking radiation seriously at all. Mutants can't shrug off radiation damage any more than anyone else, and almost every one of them dies badly. Which 3? Emma asked it before she could stop herself. Shaw. Wolverine, Logan. And Jean Grey. Who hasn't been born yet. Brian left out the fact that he could survive a nuclear blast as well. That was one of his cards, and he wasn't showing it. Emma said nothing for a long moment. This was 1962, after all. The destructive power of a nuclear bomb had been demonstrated in Japan, but what the radiation did afterwards was still barely understood. So hearing Brian say that 3 people in the entire world would live through it. Emma's faith in Shaw's plan began, for the first time, to move. Take your little lover and get out of here. And forget about avenging your brother. Shaw is more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Emma held Brian's gaze for a long beat, and said it coldly. Shaw is powerful. He isn't invincible. And I already know how to beat him. Darwin's prophecy told me. Brian looked back at her without flinching, then took the thoroughly bewildered Moira by the arm and walked her out of the Hellfire Club. Why did that psychic let us go? On the flight to England, and Oxford University, Moira was still rattled. She looked at Brian, who was gazing out at the sea of cloud beyond the window, and asked the question that had been bothering her most. Because I made her very happy. More than once. Brian's answer was short and entirely to the point. Moira sat there for a moment with absolutely no way to argue against it. Brian, you really are a bastard. After a long silence, she gave him the finger. I'll take that as a compliment. Brian was thoroughly unbothered by it. Brian, the Professor X in Darwin's prophecy. Can he really help us beat Shaw? Moira asked it with worry all over her face. Back when the two of them first left the Hellfire Club, Moira, who by then believed him completely, had asked Brian how Shaw could be beaten. Brian had held nothing back. Using Darwin's prophecy as cover, he'd told her everything he knew about Professor X. And he'd told her that out of the 14 million futures Darwin had seen with his foresight, this was the only one in which Shaw could be defeated. Moira believed him, and booked a flight to Oxford that same day. By Darwin's prediction, Professor X is the future leader of mutant kind. He'll help us beat Shaw. There's no question. Brian said it with total confidence. I hope so. She believed in Darwin's prediction. But having seen what the Hellfire Club's mutants could do, Moira's confidence still wasn't quite there. She murmured it, then turned to look at him. Brian, what are you drawing? Brian lifted his head from the sketchbook in his lap and passed the comic he'd just finished over to her. Moira took it and studied it, curious. It was laid out as a 4-panel comic. 4 different scenes. The first was simple enough. In front of an enormous bank of antennae, a bald young man in a wheelchair sat with his right hand pressed to his temple. Beside him, a line of text. Professor X, facing him stood a man wearing a shark smile. Labeled, Magneto. Above the two of them, a speech bubble. Eric, remember, your ability doesn't only answer to rage and pain. Calm will make you stronger. Behind them, a group of young mutants in the middle of training. The second scene. A unit of human soldiers firing frantically at a man in a suit. Round after round struck him and not one of them had the slightest effect. When the soldiers had emptied everything they had, the man simply lifted one foot, and a terrifying shockwave of energy swallowed them whole. Above his head, the caption, Shaw attacks CIA headquarters. The third scene. A bar. A heavily bearded man with wolfish sideburns, smoking a cigar and drinking beer. A metal dog tag hung at his throat, and it read, Wolverine, Logan. Standing next to him were the bald man in the wheelchair from the first panel, and Magneto, the one with Fassbender's face. The two of them were extending an invitation. Wolverine's response was a flat, cold look, and a large speech bubble beside his mouth. Get lost. The fourth panel was only half finished. In it Professor X wore Cerebro, and pale red figures surrounded him on every side. Brian, what is this? Moira pointed at the comic and asked it in astonishment. Moira. That's the future. Brian said it smiling. The future? She stared at him, and her hand tightened around the paper without her noticing. Darwin used to record the scenes he saw as drawings. But Darwin never trained as an artist. And as it happens, being a watchmaker, I've drawn since I was a child. So I became Darwin's illustrator. I recorded the futures for him. This is one of the ones I recorded. From the very beginning, Brian had intended to build the dead Darwin into a prophet. It was the only way he could make full use of knowing how the plot goes. It was the only way any of his predictions would hold up to scrutiny. Any move that made no sense, Brian could pin on Darwin. I got it from Darwin's foresight. Which was why he'd bought brushes and drawing paper at a roadside shop before boarding. He intended to draw the entire plot of X-Men, First Class out in advance, as a comic. By the time it mattered, one look at these predictive panels and even Professor X would be convinced Darwin had been a prophet. The comic in Moira's hands held a handful of scenes from First Class. And to make the prophecy look properly non-chronological, Brian had deliberately scrambled the order of events. As for drawing Professor X bald and in a wheelchair, that was pure mischief on Brian's part. Which is to say, it was strictly to demonstrate how accurate Darwin's predictions were. This is Professor X. Looking at the bald young man in the wheelchair, Moira's brow creased. Brian ignored her and went back to work. Thanks to the drawing ability the body's original owner had left him, the panels came out vivid and effortless, scenes arrived under his hand as easily as printing what was in his head straight onto the page. While Brian worked away at his predictive comics, the plane touched down in England. Once they were off, Moira requisitioned a car on CIA authority, and they drove straight for Oxford. An hour later. Oxford University. The Newman Bar, on campus. A crowd of young people were burning through their youth as hard as they could. At the bar itself, a handsome man in a grey tailored suit stood holding a glass of brandy, and something caught his eye. A pair of eyes. Each a completely different color from the other. Heterochromia. What a beautiful pair of eyes. And of course, the girl they belong to is beautiful too. The handsome man walked over to her and said it with impeccable manners. That is a genuinely original line. Although, if you're such a gentleman, aren't you going to buy me a drink? The girl glanced at him, visibly pleased by the compliment. Of course, my beautiful lady. This brandy was prepared specifically for you. He handed her the glass in his hand, smiling. The girl looked down at the brandy, and her smile went out. How did you know what I was drinking? He smiled and didn't answer. My name is Charles. Charles Xavier. Lovely to meet you, Miss Amy. The handsome man was the young Professor X, Charles Xavier. Across from him, the girl named Amy stared. How do you know my name is Amy? Xavier shrugged, entirely casual. Lucky guess. Amy, does it trouble you? That one eye is green and the other's blue. It shouldn't, you know. It's a textbook genetic mutation. A rather wonderful one. That mutation is what makes you different from everyone else in here, and it's what makes you gifted. Amy, I can tell you with complete certainty, you're a mutant. Xavier said it with genuine admiration. But the moment Amy heard the word mutant, her face went cold. So you chat up a girl, and then tell her she's a freak. Is that your technique? Faced with that cold stare, Xavier only smiled, perfectly calm. Mutation is a necessary stage of evolution. Don't be afraid of it, Amy, try to accept it. There was nothing but sincerity in his face, and in spite of herself, Amy was moved. To mutation, then. And to the pride you're talking about. Cheers. The Newman Bar, Oxford University. Moira watched Professor X going glass for glass against a crowd of students behind a small mountain of empty beer glasses, and her expression turned grim. Then she lowered her head and looked over Brian's prophecy comics again. This is really Professor X. Moira had her doubts. The young man in front of her had nothing whatsoever in common with the mature, composed, bald man in the wheelchair from the comics she'd just read. And not only because this Professor X was neither bald nor in a wheelchair. It was the personality. This very young Professor X looked like a man with nothing in his head but women and beer, and no sense of responsibility at all. That should still be him. Darwin often ran the future and the present together. That's why some of the people in my prophecy comics are drawn as they'll look years from now. Brian shrugged and invented it on the spot. I hope you're right. Moira's impression of this young Professor X could not have been much worse. She looked at his slightly unfocused eyes and her mouth twitched. But she trusted Brian. So Moira went to make contact with this far too young Professor X anyway. Professor X. We need your help. She said it flatly, standing over him in the middle of his revelry. Already fairly far gone, Professor X turned his head at the sound of her voice. And when he saw that Moira was a striking blonde, his eyes lit up. The blonde gene. A truly beautiful genetic mutation. Beautiful lady, on the strength of that gene alone I'm willing to give you 5 minutes to explain what help you need. Also, Professor X, excellent name. I like it very much. He looked up at her and delivered all of it. There's no time to explain. Professor X, use your telepathy. Read my memories and you'll understand everything. Explaining it all out loud would have taken Moira far too long. So she simply grabbed his right hand and pressed it against her own head. Professor X. Bewildered, he began reading her memories on reflex. A second later the haze went out of his eyes and something serious took its place. His brain, shut down and pickled in alcohol for most of the evening, came back online. Through Moira's memories, Professor X saw everything that had happened to her recently. The Hellfire Club's Sebastian Shaw. The White Queen, Emma Frost. Riptide. The Red Devil. And Shaw's plan to provoke a nuclear war between the two superpowers. And along with it. In Moira's memories, Professor X also found Brian. And the prophet Brian had spoken of. Darwin. By the time his right hand came away from her head, he was completely sober. And what he felt was complicated. Part of him was thrilled to have found fellow mutants at all. The rest of him, having learned what those fellow mutants intended, felt helpless and furious in equal measure. Because to Professor X's mind, mutants were a marker of genetic evolution and nothing more. They were still human underneath. So he could not understand Shaw's ambition to build a mutant world out of nuclear radiation. And he could not understand Shaw's mutant supremacist creed either. Agent Moira. I'll help you stop Shaw. Professor X drew a long breath and said it to her gravely. The Hellfire Club's mutants were all formidable. No conventional human army was going to stop Shaw. Only mutants can beat mutants. Before that, will you introduce me to Mr. Kent? He looked at her as he asked it. Because at this moment Professor X was a great deal more interested in the Brian from her memories than in Moira herself. Or, more precisely, in Brian and the dead prophet, Darwin. Through Moira's memories, Professor X had learned what Brian's mutant ability was. Adaptive evolution. He had only seen Brian's shadow form in those memories. But as a professor of genetics, he understood exactly what adaptive evolution implied. It meant Brian was the only mutant capable of evolving without limit. An ability like that amounts to something very close to immortality. But survival of the fittest came with a range of drawbacks too. First, Brian had no way of controlling the ability. Second, it could only adapt to one extreme environment at a time. Having assembled everything he knew, Professor X arrived at a summary. Brian was very strong. And very limited. Even so, he was more interested in Darwin, the level 4 precognitive Brian had described. Darwin was dead, yes. But Professor X had seen the prophecy comics in Moira's memories. The ones titled X-Men, First Class. Brian hadn't finished drawing them. Still, Professor X had a feeling that First Class was their future. Which was exactly why he wanted to meet Brian. He was hoping to learn more, out of Brian's own memories, about that mysterious prophet. Mr. Darwin. Professor X. That's Brian. At his request, Moira walked him over to the bar. A young, good-looking Asian man was sitting loosely on a stool there, smiling as he talked to a girl with an angel's face and a devil's figure. The Asian man was Brian. So there you have it, my beautiful angel. I'm a mutant. God saw fit to make me gifted. At the bar, Brian smiled and dipped the fingers of his right hand into a glass of cocktail burning with blue flame. The moment his fingers met the fire, adaptive evolution triggered. His skin turned the same blue as the flame in the glass, fast enough to watch it happen. He looked like some kind of blue spirit. Strange flame-shaped markings surfaced across his skin as well. They made him more striking, and stranger. That's incredible. The girl in front of him showed neither shock nor alarm at the blue skin. She looked at him the way you look at your own kind. Brian, aren't you afraid people will think you're a freak? Brian didn't answer her. He stood up and whistled. The whistle cut sharply across the bar. Everyone in the room turned to look at him on reflex. And when they saw the blue skin and the flame patterns running across it, the whole bar froze. Then astonishment came into their faces, and behind it, fear. "Brian. We should go." The girl beside him stepped in front of him, worried, and said it low. "Raven. What are you doing here? Go home. Now." Professor X had walked up just in time to catch Brian putting his ability on display. But Brian wasn't what concerned him at this moment. He was looking at the girl standing in front of Brian, and his voice was hard. "Charles, I'm an adult. I'm not a child anymore." The girl with the angel's face and the devil's figure was the future Mystique. Raven. From the moment he'd walked into the bar, Brian's ability had been sounding its warning. Seeing through the operating laws of all things made it trivially easy for him to pick Raven out, drinking alone in the crowd, drowning something. Raven is every man's dream. She was Brian's too. So Brian had gone straight to her without hesitating. He'd announced himself as a mutant, and won her acceptance without difficulty. And the reason for the scene now unfolding was this: Brian intended to use his ability to stamp himself permanently into Raven's mind. He wanted to become Raven's spiritual mentor. And then to reshape her, inside and out, into whatever he wanted her to be. Inside the Newman bar, the pounding heavy metal had stopped. What replaced it was a hushed, startled kind of tension. Every person in the room was staring at the bar with revulsion and fear. And at the bar stood Brian, his skin still burning blue. "Mr. Kent. Don't reveal that you're a mutant in front of ordinary people. It will only bring you trouble." Behind him, Professor X frowned, put his right hand to his temple, and passed the warning across by telepathy. Telepathy of that kind only carries the sender's thoughts. There's no psychic intrusion involved. So it didn't trigger Brian's adaptive evolution at all. Hearing the warning, Brian simply turned and smiled at him. Credit where it's due, Professor X really was young and handsome at this point in his life. But that was all he was. The Professor X of this era was not yet the leader of mutant kind he would become. So watching Brian put his ability on open display, all Professor X offered was a well-meant warning. He made no move to stop him. "Raven. Take a good look at what happens when you reveal your ability carelessly." Having warned Brian, Professor X turned and sent the same to Raven, standing at Brian's side. Raven glanced around the room on reflex. And when she saw the revulsion and the fear in all those faces, her expression darkened. That was the way people look at a freak. As a mutant herself, Raven knew perfectly well that every person here had already filed Brian, who had shown them his ability so casually, under exactly that word. "Brian. Let's get out of here." Raven tugged at him, worried, and took 2 steps back without meaning to. She was frightened. Because through Brian she had just seen precisely how much ordinary people were willing to accept mutants. Which was, not at all. And that frightened her badly. Because it meant that humans would never be able to accept Raven's true blue form either. Seeing her fear, Brian drew her gently into his arms and said, "Lo. Raven. Remember what I told you. We're the ones God favors. We don't need to hide. And the only reason these people can't accept us, the only reason they fear us, is that they can't see any hope of becoming us. The moment they can see that hope, they'll worship us. They'll fear us the way people fear God." Brian's low voice did its work, and Raven's fear went out of her. She looked at him steadily. And then she kissed him, deeply, before she could stop herself. When it ended, Brian glanced around the bar and hopped up onto the counter. With the entire room's fear and disgust fixed on him, he calmly straightened the clothes the kiss had rumpled. Then he looked down at all of them and said, smiling, "Ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Brian. Brian Kent. A few days ago, I was an anonymous watchmaker in Brooklyn. Today, a few days later, I'm a superhuman. And not only can I turn my skin blue, I can also stop bullets. Brian pulled the pistol from his pocket as he said it, put the muzzle against his own head, and pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation. Bang! The shot went off deafeningly loud inside the bar. Under a room full of stunned eyes, Brian took a bullet to the forehead and was completely unharmed. I wasn't born with any of this. I was an ordinary man. Same as all of you. I was simply luckier than you are. I had the good fortune to be selected by Vought. Brian let his voice trail off there. He was waiting for someone to ask. And sure enough, a young man asked it almost before he could stop himself. You got your powers from Vought? What's Vought? Brian answered in the same low, resonant register he'd been using all along. Vought is a genetic research institute. Its purpose is to assemble a team of superhero celebrities. Vaught's philosophy is simple: if you have a dream, and if you have the potential to become a superhero, you can join. Vought will tailor a superpower to your own genetic code. And from that day forward you leave ordinary life behind and become a superhero the whole world watches. Brian laid out Vaught's creed with real feeling. Out on the floor, people had begun glancing at each other. Without any of them noticing, the fear and revulsion aimed at Brian had drained away fast. What replaced it was interest. Curiosity about Vought. This was the age when individual heroism was exploding. Superhero comics, films and television were multiplying at speed. And they had planted a superhero dream in the heart of every young person alive. Mutants, this crowd might struggle to accept. But call a mutant a superhero, and they'd come around to Brian's way of thinking without any trouble at all. You're born a mutant. It can't be manufactured. A superhero can be manufactured. Captain America's comics had been a worldwide phenomenon for years now. Brian is in the mutant universe. There are no real superheroes here, only mutants. Captain America exists as fiction. From 80-year-old men to children barely able to walk. Everyone knew the story: a scrawny nobody became a superhero because of one dose of super soldier serum. Plenty of young people dreamed of getting hold of a serum like that. They'd always assumed it was a fantasy and nothing more. But having watched what Brian could do, the superhero dream inside them had begun to catch light again. Vought? Superheroes? Seriously? We could become superheroes? The young people in the crowd were looking at Brian very differently now. He was no longer some alien freak to them. He had become the beacon pointing the way to becoming a superhero. Of course. Anyone can become a superhero. A chameleon's body changes at will to match its surroundings. A toad's tongue extends 10 meters in an instant. Turritopsis dohrnii, the immortal jellyfish, never dies at all. These are all forms of extraordinary ability. And what determines that ability is the gene sequence inside your body. In most people, those genes are recessive. After years of work, Vought and the American military have jointly developed a genetic compound. Vought named it Compound V. Compound V activates the recessive gene fragments hidden in an ordinary person's DNA, and gives you extraordinary power. And Vought will train that power with you until you're a superhero worth the name. As he spoke, Brian took a blue sweet out of his pocket and held it up with total gravity. It was a piece of candy he'd picked up from a sweet shop on the way here. It would do perfectly well as Compound V. Holy hell, Compound V is real. That girl actually got powers. Oh my god. Vought really can make superheroes. Inside the Newman bar. A room full of ordinary people showed not a trace of fear or revulsion anymore. Quite the opposite. They were staring at Raven with burning eyes and exclaiming out loud. Because Raven had let herself return to her true form. Blue skin. Blue scale patterning. Skin nothing like an ordinary person's, and rather than ruining her beauty, it made her more striking than before. Her figure especially. A body that was all heat, a narrow waist, curves in every place a curve could go, and supple with it. A devil's figure, plainly. Standing there and doing nothing at all, she could pull the attention of every man in the room. Raven. Don't show them your blue form. Watching her, Professor X's frown deepened further. Raven ignored the telepathic message entirely. It was the first time she had ever shown her true form in public. And the first time that showing it had earned her praise instead of disgust and fear. Being seen, and admired, was going slightly to her head. Incredible. Raven, you've never looked more beautiful than you do right now. Beside her, Brian delivered the compliment with total sincerity. Raven looked up at him. Brian filled her entirely at that moment, body and mind. He was the one who had won her recognition and praise from a whole room. He was the one who had let her use her ability openly, in front of everyone, without being treated as a freak. And who had got her cheers and applause instead. So she played along with him. Raven didn't only show them her true form. She ran through a whole series of transformations. Every one of them drew cheers, and envy. Very good, Miss Raven. Welcome to VOT. We'll help you develop your ability, and cover every expense you need covered. Now, you'll want to think of a superhero codename. Brian played the part to the hilt, face entirely serious. Mystique. Raven said it almost before he'd finished. She had settled on the name Mystique a long time ago. Everyone, let's hear it for our newest superhero. Mystique. Brian took her right arm and raised it high. The whole bar erupted. Mystique. Mystique. VOT. VOT. Superhero. Superhero. The cheering went up on every side. These people had been skeptical of everything Brian said not 10 minutes ago. But they had watched Raven become Mystique with their own eyes. And now nobody doubted a word of it. Every person in that room was a top student at Oxford University, and every one of them sank helplessly into the lie Brian had built for them. They envied Raven her powers. They wanted to be superheroes too. VOT welcomes anyone with the potential to be a superhero. Join VOT, and money, power, beauty and fame are all within reach. Brian's delivery was fervent, and it left the room itching to act. Me, I want to join VOT. I want to be a superhero. I want power nobody can match. Money. Women. Influence. The whole bar was at boiling point. Every one of them wanted to join a company that did not exist. And every one of them looked at Brian with nothing but awe and admiration. Nobody entertained the possibility that he was lying. In America, where freedom is the highest virtue, you can tell people the earth is flat and a great many of them will believe you, and go on believing it. Register your names now. Over the coming days you'll work on cultivating the bearing of a superhero, until we judge that you meet the criteria for conversion. At that point VOT will send you an invitation. A few sentences and Brian had the whole crowd of duped humans handled. Registration took them half an hour, and then they filed out of the bar carrying the dream of becoming superheroes. Brian, you really are my hero. Raven threw herself at him, thrilled. She displayed a flexibility nobody else had, wrapping herself around him like an octopus. If Professor X hadn't still been standing in the bar, Raven would have merged herself into him entirely. Raven. Remember what I told you. We mutants are supreme. Brian ran a hand over her blue skin. Scaled as it was startlingly smooth, not the least bit rough under his palm. Mutants are supreme. Raven said it with fervor, and something close to reverence, her eyes fixed on him. Good. Now give me that list. Brian set her down and said it evenly. Raven handed over the registration list in her hand without hesitating. Brian put it away with great care. Because he really was going to found VOT. Partly to gather mutants under VOT's name, and then pick out the highest grade ones and open their brains. And partly to build VOT into a superhero monopoly, one that could pull in the general public and eventually bring them on side. Mutants are a minority, after all. This world still belongs to humans. If you want a comfortable life inside human society, you need ordinary people's support and their backing. And these hundreds of Oxford students were Vaught's future workforce. Credit where it's due, Brian had learned the capitalist's playbook front to back. Of course, Vaught was a project for later. Mr. Kent. We need to talk. Once the list was away, Professor X finally ran out of patience, walked over, and said it frowning. He was plainly unhappy about Brian deceiving ordinary people. And what made him unhappier still was that Brian showing off his own ability was one thing. Raven had followed his lead. Professor X had always thought of Raven as his sister. He understood exactly how bad the situation was for mutants in this world. So he had always kept her carefully protected. And Raven had always listened to him. But since Brian appeared, all of that had changed. Raven had turned rebellious. She no longer took anything Professor X taught her as final. And Professor X had begun to feel that he was losing her. Professor X, you're very different from the man I saw in Darwin's foresight. Brian turned to face him as he said it. At which Professor X's expression noticeably darkened. He had seen Darwin's prophecy comics too, the ones in which he was a bald man in a wheelchair. England. A detached house near Oxford University. Professor X had bought the place for convenience while he was teaching. He was, after all, a genuine member of the British aristocracy. Which made Professor X a billionaire in the fullest sense. He hadn't only inherited the vast Xavier estate, he'd inherited hundreds of millions in assets along with it. Buying a house was small change. Filthy capitalists. Brian couldn't help grumbling as he looked the place over. Moira, Brian. Please, sit. Once they were in the living room, Professor X nodded them both to seats and poured 2 cups of coffee. Professor X, we don't have time to waste. Shaw could put his plan into motion at any moment. Moira sat with the coffee in her hands and said it anxiously. As a CIA agent, she understood exactly how tense the international situation had become. War was very close. Moira, take it easy. The professor and I still have things to discuss. Seeing how wound up she was, Brian patted her shoulder gently and gave a small laugh. Moira drew a long breath and steadied herself. Fine. You two talk first. She glanced at Brian and left the living room with Raven. That left Professor X and Brian alone. The two of them simply looked at one another, and neither spoke first. It was a full 5 minutes before the young Professor X broke the silence. Mr. Kent. I'm curious about how you classify mutants. He asked it with genuine interest. Ever since reading Moira's memories, Professor X had been curious about Brian's classification system. Until now, mutant power levels had been an entirely vague matter. Even Professor X could only sense that someone was strong. He had no way of saying how strong. Which was why he was so eager to know how Brian divided them up. The mutant hierarchy was worked out by my brother Darwin, after his foresight gave him the idea. Brian did not say that he had built the system himself. He handed the credit to a man who was already dead. That way, if Professor X tried to dig into it, Brian could simply say he didn't know. The truth was that the mutant tier system had been assembled by Marvel fans back in his own world, and even Brian only half understood it. There was no chance whatsoever of explaining to Professor X how he had derived it. So, pin everything on Darwin. Darwin divided mutants into 5 levels. Level 1. The ability has only just awakened, it's very weak, and they have no control over it at all. Level 2. Slightly stronger than Level 1. They've begun to grasp the ability, but they still lose control regularly. Level 3. The ability is powerful, they control it well, and they have real combat capability. Level 4. The ability is enormously powerful and completely under their command, as naturally as moving their own hand. Their combat capability is terrifying. Level 5. Only a handful of mutants ever reach it. As a rule, every level 5 mutant has an ability that borders on divine, and conventional methods will not beat them. And of course, according to Darwin, there is one more tier above level 5. The Omega level, also called God tier. A mutant at that level can fairly be called a god among mutants. Brian ran through the hierarchy briskly. By that system, what level am I? Professor X couldn't stop himself asking. Level 4. Brian glanced at him and gave it flatly. And Shaw? Level 5. Hearing that Shaw was a level 5, the color went out of Professor X's face. Shaw is that strong? He said it as though he didn't want to believe it. By Brian's own account, a level 5 mutant was as powerful as a god and near enough impossible to kill. Shaw can absorb the energy of a nuclear reactor, and survive a nuclear detonation. Brian glanced at him and offered the helpful reminder. Christ. Survive a nuclear detonation? Is he even human? Professor X swore again in spite of himself. He prided himself on being a well-informed man, and hearing that Shaw could take a nuclear blast still shook him. Mr. Kent, will you tell me about Darwin? His precognition interests me enormously. Now that he understood the levels, Professor X was more interested than ever in the level 4 precog. Of course. Darwin was like you, he awakened his ability very young. Brian was preparing to start lying again. But Professor X clearly had no intention of sitting through it. He was going to send his telepathy directly into Brian's mind and look at the Prophet Darwin's memory himself. Telepathy makes no sound. But the instant Professor X pushed into Brian's brain, Brian felt it. And the moment his mind took that psychic impact, it had already evolved something new. Brian called it, Mind Seal. He could use his own conscious will to close his brain off completely. Every memory, every thought, every emotion inside it sealed away in the deepest layer of his inner world. Unless Professor X could locate the sealed core buried in the depths of Brian's subconscious and break it, he would never surface a single memory or private thought of Brian's. And Mind Seal did more than lock things away. It could also use conscious will to build false memories, purpose-made to defeat a psychic's reading. The false memories Brian could construct were indistinguishable from real ones. Never mind the Professor X sitting across from him now. Even the Professor X of the future, the one in the wheelchair, wouldn't be able to tell they were fabricated. Professor X, since you want to look, then look. As it happens, I can use these memories to prove Darwin was a prophet. Brian closed his eyes and began weaving false memories out of conscious will. It took him barely a moment to finish. At the same instant, Professor X began to read. In the mental world. Professor X's consciousness sank down into Brian's memory. Scene after scene surfaced in front of him. Brian as a small child, falling into water by accident, and awakening his mutant ability in the crisis of nearly dying. Brian at 7 years old, finding a black boy under a bridge, scrawling frantically across the concrete. That boy was Darwin as a child. Professor X reached out casually, and the scrolling memory stopped where it was. Then the little scene played itself out in front of him. Brian Kent. You're finally here. The boy stopped scrawling and turned to look at him. Child Brian flinched at the sight of Darwin's pure white eyes. Who are you? How do you know my name? He looked at Darwin with fear and curiosity in equal measure, and asked it carefully. I'm Darwin. One of your own kind, and your closest friend in the years to come. I've seen your future, and mine. I've seen what's fated for me. You will become something the whole world admires and fears. And I will be your guide. I'll use my ability to point you forward. Professor X looked at the frozen scene for a while, then walked over to where Darwin's scrawl covered the wall and studied it closely. Is this a nuclear explosion? The marks looked like meaningless scribble at first. But read carefully, Professor X could make out what they represented. A nuclear explosion. One that hadn't happened yet. The living room of Professor X's house. Professor X lowered his hand from his temple, shaken and visibly moved. He looked at Brian for a long moment, and there was a great deal going on behind his eyes. He had just pushed his telepathy into Brian's mind and read his memories. He had seen Brian as a child, newly awakened, hated and feared by everyone around him. Bullied, even. A freak, in the mouths of the people he lived among. And even so, Brian had never resented them, and had never hidden himself. He was not afraid to use his ability in front of others. However much they feared and hated him for it. The child Brian had used his own conduct to tell people that what he had was an ability. Professor X was moved by the unshakable conviction of that child. He had also seen Brian after Darwin came into his life. Darwin was only a boy himself, and yet he had become a mentor, using his precognition, over and over, to see what was coming and guide Brian in developing his own power. He saw that the two of them had been as close as brothers. And he saw the prophecy comics the two boys had drawn together. In those comics, Professor X saw the scene of his own childhood meeting with Raven. He saw a small boy screaming in agony in front of the gates of Auschwitz, and in front of that boy, an iron gate slowly buckling and twisting out of shape. He saw Shaw, with a colossal nuclear detonation rising behind him. He saw humans beyond counting evolving into mutants in the radiation after the blast, and then dying horribly of that same radiation. He saw vast numbers of robots. They were called Sentinels. And he saw other scenes that plainly belonged to the future. But those were scattered and fragmentary, and Professor X could not assemble any real picture of what was coming out of them. Which was, of course, deliberate. When he built the false memories, Brian had packed in a great deal of X-Men plot to sell Darwin as a prophet. But to stop Professor X reading the actual future out of it and costing him his advantage. Most of the scenes Brian chose were plausible on the surface and meaningless underneath. They looked like something. What they actually meant was not anything Professor X could work out. In Brian's memory, Professor X also saw Darwin die. To stop the nuclear detonation he had foreseen, Darwin had used his precognition to find Shaw, and tried to talk him out of the plan. And Brian had watched Shaw cut Darwin's head open and destroy his brain. Brian, who had seen it happen, had been destroyed by it. Years of brotherhood turned to hatred and blinded him. He wanted Shaw dead. But Shaw was far too strong. There was no version of that fight Brian won. Which was why Brian had gone to Moira, and then come to him. Brian. I'm so sorry about Darwin. The reading over, Professor X's face was full of grief. Brian's pain, inside those memories, had got into him. Professor X, what did you just do to me? Brian played along beautifully, summoning up the grief the reading had supposedly stirred, and asked it with pain all over his face. I'm very sorry, Brian. I read your memories without asking your permission. Professor X stood and apologized with complete sincerity. Then he put out his right hand, formally, and made his offer. Brian. I hope we can work together well. Professor X. To a pleasant cooperation. Brian looked at him and saw that the man trusted him entirely now, which made his smile a genuine one. And as the two of them shook hands, Brian had successfully worked his way into Professor X's team. After this it was only a matter of moving the plot along steadily. Let Professor X use Cerebro to hunt for mutants, and Brian could take advantage of the chaos to find powerful abilities and harvest them. Brian, by Darwin's prophecy, how do we stop Shaw? Professor X asked him for guidance, without a trace of pride about it. Having examined Brian's memories, he was convinced Darwin had been a prophet. And Brian was Darwin's brother and his collaborator on the prophecy comics. which made Brian half a prophet himself. Darwin said that in the port city of Miami, Florida, another future leader of mutant kind will appear, the magnetic field man, and attempt to assassinate Shaw. If we want to beat Shaw, we need this magnetic field man's help. Brian handed over the next stretch of plot without any particular ceremony. Another mutant leader? The magnetic field man? Is that a code name? Or is it his ability? Professor X was baffled. He had a strong feeling that magnetic field man was some sort of nickname, but he had nothing to go on. That's what Darwin called him. Brian shrugged and pushed it all onto Darwin. Very well. Let's go to Miami and meet this magnetic field man. Professor X thought it over briefly and decided to follow the prophecy to Florida. And having decided, he wasted no time, he passed the decision straight to Moira and Raven by telepathy. Excellent. Are we going to get a fight out of this? Raven was delighted by the news. Moira frowned. Professor X, Brian, I think our first move should be reporting Shaw's intelligence to CIA headquarters. She was a CIA agent, and her first instinct was to report both the existence of mutants and Shaw's conspiracy. Moira. The CIA's leadership will not tolerate mutants existing. Brian glanced at her and said it evenly. Now that he had successfully embedded himself in Professor X's team, Moira's usefulness had dropped close to nothing. And there was no chance at all he was letting her report mutants to CIA leadership. The moment the CIA's leadership learned mutants were real, they would lock every mutant they could find in a laboratory and run inhumane research on them. And the position of mutants everywhere would get considerably worse. Brian, you have to have some faith in CIA leadership. They aren't going to round up every mutant alive. Moira held her position on reporting regardless of what he said. Which made Brian frown. His expression shifted, by degrees, from calm to something cold, and the warmth went out of his eyes when he looked at her. He walked over to her and, under her puzzled gaze, and Professor X's, pressed his right hand to her forehead. Mind seal. Brian said it under his breath, and his conscious will release the newly evolved ability. Unlike the adaptations his body produced, which faded and regressed once the extreme environment was gone. There is no regression in the evolution of consciousness. From the moment Mind Seal evolved, it was carved permanently into Brian's mind. He could use it whenever and wherever he liked, as naturally as moving his own hand. Mind Seal was now Brian's second mutant ability. From here on, anyone who went looking through Brian's memories would come back with nothing. And at this moment, with his right hand against Moira's forehead, his conscious will drove Mind Seal forward. It sank straight down into her brain. And Moira's memories of the last several days were read out of her at speed. Mind Seal can use the mind to bury every memory, emotion and thought deep in the brain. It can also, to a degree, read them. It isn't Professor X's power, of course, he can read a lifetime in an instant. Mind Seal can only reach a few days back. For Brian's purposes, a few days was plenty. Buzz. Brian found Moira's memories of the past several days, and then used Mind Seal to bury every one of them deep in her subconscious. When he took his right hand away, the clarity had gone out of her eyes. Why am I here? Who are you? Why am I here? Who are you? In Professor X's house, Moira looked around at Brian and the others, thoroughly confused, and her voice had gone stiff and formal. Agent Moira. You really don't remember? Brian looked at her calmly and asked it. Remember what? She stared back at him, lost. You came out to Oxford yesterday and drank far too much. I was good enough to bring you back here. Brian said it without batting an eye. Really? Ugh, why can't I remember any of it? Moira eyed him suspiciously and tried to drag yesterday back out of her head. But the harder she reached for it, the more her mind fogged over, and it began to hurt, faintly. And not only yesterday. She couldn't recover the last several days at all. Agent Moira? Brian's voice pulled her back to herself. She glanced at the three of them and found she had no impression of any of them whatsoever. They must be nobody important. Hangovers do that. Would you like a coffee? Brian took a cup from the machine beside him, easily, and held it out with a smile. That's kind of you, sir. But I have to go, I've got an assignment to finish. Moira said it and walked straight out of the house. Watching her go, Professor X frowned and turned to Brian. Brian. What did you do to her? Faced with the question, Brian answered lightly. Nothing much. I deleted her memories of us, and of mutants. Professor X went still for a moment. He looked at Brian in astonishment. He'd had no idea Brian possessed any other mutant ability. You can delete memories? He asked it before he could stop himself. Brian had been waiting for exactly that question. The truth was that from the moment he'd sealed Moira's memories, he'd known Professor X would ask. And he'd had his answer ready in advance. Honestly? It surprised me too. Professor X, you know my ability is survival of the fittest. I adapt to extreme environments, and my body evolves to match. And after you read my memories with your telepathy, I found I'd adapted a new ability. What's more, this one doesn't seem to regress when the extreme environment goes away. Brian explained it at length, with real excitement. Then, as though he'd spotted the confusion on Professor X's and Raven's faces, he added. The short version is that I've adapted a whole new mutant ability. That's never happened to me before, not once in all these years. It's extraordinary. He'd barely finished before Raven said, admiringly. Brian, your ability is unbelievable, you can adapt other abilities. What's the second one you've got? Memory deletion. If I touch someone's skin, I can use my mind to delete what's in their head. It's very weak, though. 3 days is the most I can reach back. There was no chance whatsoever that Brian was telling Professor X about Mind Seal. He'd worked out how to disguise it long before the question came. In the American series Heroes, there's a character called the Haitian, whose power is erasing memories. Brian simply mapped that onto Mind Seal. The end result of having your memories buried is no different from having them erased anyway. Survival of the fittest can adapt new mutant abilities. Brian, you're stronger than I thought. There was something close to envy in Professor X's voice. He'd already known Brian's ability was formidable, and that there was almost nothing that could kill him. But adapting an entirely new mutant ability put his potential somewhere else altogether. Professor X, the fact that I can adapt a new mutant ability genuinely thrills me. Brian appeared to be completely lost in his own excitement. It was a full 5 minutes before he let out a helpless sigh. The trouble is I can't control the ability at all. Adapting memory deletion might have been pure coincidence. Watching him swing up and then down like that, Raven came over, put her arms around him gently, and said. Brian, you'll master it. And then you'll adapt a second ability, and a third. You'll get there. Thank you, Raven. Brian smiled, took her face in his hand, and kissed her for a long moment. His goal was accomplished. From here on, even if he cut open other mutants' brains and took their abilities, so long as Professor X didn't witness it, he could put it all down to adaptive evolution. If anyone asks, it's a new ability I adapted. What? Why does my ability look like that other mutant's? Isn't that obvious? I adapted it from exposure to that mutant. Does that hold up? It holds up beautifully. Brian had found himself a cover story that made his power stealing entirely reasonable, and it put him in an excellent mood. He rather wanted to go and celebrate with Raven. Unfortunately, Professor X was still standing there, which put an end to that. Brian. You still haven't told me why you deleted Moira's memories. Professor X pressed on. If human leadership learns that mutants exist, what's their first reaction? Brian didn't answer him. He asked it back, seriously. Round up every mutant alive. Professor X answered on reflex. That's why I deleted her memories. If Moira told CIA leadership that mutants exist, that's the same as announcing us to the world. And human leadership would spend anything to wipe us out. Professor X had no answer to that. As a psychic, Professor X understood the ugliness in human nature better than most. He knew perfectly well how human leadership would respond the moment it learned mutants were real. Being captured and studied would be the good outcome. What actually waited for mutants was total extermination. Humans will do anything to wipe out whatever isn't like them. Professor X sighed. He knew Brian's decision was the right one. He still couldn't make himself accept it. She was with you through all of this, you know. She thought of you as a friend. Professor X said it with a bitter smile. Professor, I know. Moira is my friend. Deleting her memories hurt me. Brian drew a long breath, and then his face went cold. But for the future of mutant kind. The sacrifices that have to be made are worth making. If it keeps my own people from being hunted down by human armies, I'll make them. Everything for mutant kind. Brian delivered it with total conviction. In reality, deleting Moira's memories had cost Brian nothing at all. Moira was a stepping stone, and nothing else, the way into Professor X. And he was inside Professor X's team now. Which made her entirely expendable. He'd slept with her, yes. He'd slept with hundreds of women, of every description. What exactly did Moira amount to? If she had taken the advice when it was offered, none of this would have been necessary. But she insisted on her own position. So she could hardly blame Brian for being ruthless about it. Passengers, our flight to Miami, Florida will shortly begin its descent. Please remain seated. On the flight to Miami, Brian, Professor X and Raven were sitting in first class. With the Moira problem solved, the three of them had boarded a plane without pausing for breath, bound for Miami to save Magneto, who was, shortly, about to get badly beaten by Shaw. At this moment Brian sat in a soft, comfortable seat, absorbed in drawing his prophecy comics. Raven held several of the finished ones in both hands and studied them, fascinated. Brian's prophecy comics still used the 4-panel format. In them, an enormous luxury yacht was drawn in careful detail. Aboard it, the Hellfire Club's members were holding a celebration. And out on the water beside the yacht, a man with a face full of hatred stood with his arms spread wide, while a heavy chain wound itself around the hull like a python. The panels that followed showed that man being beaten by Shaw, despair written all over his face. Is this what's going to happen in Miami? Professor X studied the comic with a serious expression and asked it, surprised. Yes. That's the future, as it's going to happen. Brian nodded, entirely calm. Brian, is this magnetic field man's power controlling steel? Then he shouldn't be called the magnetic field man at all. He should be Magneto. On Brian's left, Raven pointed at the man bending the chain and said it with a grin. Brian turned and looked at her. He had to admit it, Raven had a real appetite for handing mutants code names. Come to think of it, Professor X, Magneto, and every codename the X-Men would eventually carry had all been hers. Something of a codename specialist, this one. By the time Brian finished the last of the prophecy comics, the plane was touching down at Miami Airport. The three of them walked out of the terminal. Standing outside, Professor X and Raven both looked at Brian. Which port is Shaw's yacht in? Professor X couldn't help asking it. Professor X, I think you're leaning on Darwin's prophecy rather too heavily. Darwin always said his foresight could only point us in a direction. We still have to find where Shaw is hiding ourselves. Brian read his expression and said it gravely. He only knew the plot. And the plot does not come with map coordinates. There was no way on Earth he could know which port Shaw's yacht was tied up at. Professor X blinked at the reprimand, and then smiled ruefully. Brian was right. He had been leaning on Darwin's prophecy too heavily. So heavily that he'd forgotten he was a mutant himself. And a level 4 psychic at that. Professor X stopped hesitating. He pressed his right hand to his temple, and an enormous wave of psychic power swept out across the whole of Miami. As the most powerful telepath alive, Professor X's range extended for hundreds of kilometers. Roughly the area of New York City. As the telepathy went out, projections of countless minds surfaced in front of him. And then their thoughts arrived, like a tsunami. The noise of it twisted his face with pain. The fingers at his temple began to tremble. The third port. A second later Professor X named the port where Shaw's yacht was moored, with visible effort, and pulled his power back, drained. Professor X was still only a level 4 mutant. He was a very long way from the bald professor of the future, who could wipe out half the consciousness on Earth with a thought. Let's go. The third port. Having got what he wanted, Brian clapped him on the shoulder, smiling, and said with a small laugh. You all right there, Professor? Can you still walk? I could find you a wheelchair if not. Professor X, still breathing hard, responded to the teasing by giving Brian the finger. Clearly you don't need any help. Come on, Raven, third port. Brian shrugged, took Raven by the hand, flagged down a taxi, and was gone. Brian, is it really all right leaving the professor behind? In the taxi, Raven watched Professor X shrinking into the distance with some concern. Raven, I didn't want him intruding on our time together. Brian put an arm around her and said it softly. Brian. Spoken to like that, Raven couldn't help being moved. Something warm settled over the back of the taxi. Until Brian opened his mouth and destroyed it. Raven, turn into a succubus. With a heart-shaped tail. Raven. She stared at him for a moment, then rolled her eyes. And then, because she was fond of him, she obliged his somewhat unusual tastes anyway. Incredible. Looking at the elegant, dangerous-looking succubus beside him, heart-shaped tail swaying steadily back and forth, Brian let out a low whistle. Driver, change of destination. The Vienna Hotel. With a woman like that on his arm, Brian's appetite was thoroughly up. The rescue could wait a while. He had more pressing business. Professor X watched the taxi abruptly change lanes, and stood there stunned. Then he swore at Brian over telepathy. You have got to be kidding me. Brian, you absolute. Damn it. Brian ignored him completely. The taxi carried Brian and Raven to the Vienna Hotel. Damn it. Professor X, finally recovering himself, watched the taxi disappear and rather wanted to kill Brian. He had always thought of Raven as his own sister. How was he supposed to feel calm watching a man he'd known less than a day walk off with her? But Raven had no objection to any of it, so all Professor X could do was seethe. He settled for out of sight, out of mind. He used his telepathy to take control of a man driving a Ferrari and had him hand the car over. Then Professor X put his foot down, and the Ferrari tore away. He intended to go to the third port himself and get ahead of the Hellfire Club, scout their movements and see whether there was any chance of rescuing the man in Darwin's prediction. Ah! Magneto. And, presumably, wait for Brian and Raven. Damn it. Behind the wheel, Professor X swore again. 6 hours later, and near enough dusk. The setting sun laid gold across the water, and the whole harbor glittered. Brian arrived at Miami's third port with Raven, who was smiling as well. It has to be said, Raven really is every man's dream. Brian had spent the afternoon experiencing the full kaleidoscope of her shape-shifting. It turned out Raven couldn't only take the shape of any woman. She could manage humanoid female forms too, an angel with white wings, a succubus with a heart-shaped tail, a demon with goat's horns curling from her head. Which sent Brian into raptures. Because Raven could satisfy any taste of his, however specific. Before he knew it, 6 hours had gone. The moment they reached the port, Brian saw the enormous luxury yacht moored there. And aboard it, Shaw and the rest were holding their celebration. In the water below the hull, a man in black was swimming quietly toward the yacht. On the shore, Professor X stood with his right hand at his temple, talking to the man in the water. Eric. Don't let hatred run your head. You can't beat Shaw. You're a level 3 mutant. Shaw is a level 5. The gap between you is not subtle. Shut up, Charles. The man in black had had enough of the lecturing. He turned in the water and shouted it back at the shore. The man in black was the future Magneto. Eric Lencher. Except that Magneto was still in his 20s. Still very young. And his mutant ability had barely crossed the threshold into level 3. Since the end of the Second World War, Magneto had been hunting Shaw across the entire world. Which had driven his control over metal forward in enormous strides. It still wasn't level 4. Only the Magneto who reaches his fully realized state, after Professor X's specialized training, belongs among the level 4 mutants. Editor's note: the source names that state with a term, fascimen, that I can't reconstruct with any confidence. Rendered descriptively above. Flagged in my notes. As for level 5, that has to wait until Apocalypse, the ancient mutant god, is woken. Brian looked at the young Magneto, blind with hatred, and settled in on the shore to watch the show. Professor X, looks like you've won Magneto's trust. Brian walked over as Magneto swam on toward the yacht, clapped him on the shoulder and said it grinning. Damn it, Brian, you're finally here. Professor X looked at him with a complicated expression. Part of him was furious that Brian had made off with Raven. The rest of him was full of admiration. There was no question about it. Brian was a role model for men everywhere. How are things looking over there with Shaw? Brian didn't concern himself with the look on Professor X's face. He studied the yacht and asked it. Shaw already knows we're here. At the question, Professor X's expression turned serious. Then he brought Brian up to date on everything that had happened. While Brian and Raven had been busy, Professor X had reached the third port. And he'd happened to run into Magneto, who was also on Shaw's trail. It was the first time the two of them had met, and they took to each other instantly. Particularly once each realized the other was a mutant. And that they were hunting the same man. The two of them talked for a long time on the shore. To their surprise, they found their thinking about mutants lined up almost exactly. The conversation went beautifully. Within a few hours, Professor X and Magneto were close friends. Professor X even told him about Shaw's insane plan. He told him about Brian, about Raven, and about the Prophet Darwin. And Magneto told Professor X what had been done to him as a child in the camps. Then Professor X invited him to join the team and fight Shaw together. Magneto agreed without hesitating. But the two of them did not agree on how to fight Shaw. Professor X's position was that Shaw was formidable, and 4 mutants alone could not take him on. He wanted to recruit more powerful mutants before going anywhere near him. But Magneto had spent more than 10 years and endured God knows what to finally get a fix on Shaw. He was not about to let an opportunity this rare go. Even after Professor X gave him the rundown on the mutant classification system, Magneto was unmoved. Which was how the current situation had come about. Took to each other instantly. Kindred spirits. Brian looked at Professor X, who was beaming like a gossipy auntie, felt a distinct chill, and quietly took a step away from him. Brian, we have to stop Eric. He isn't a match for Shaw. Not yet. Professor X didn't notice Brian's expression at all. His eyes hadn't left Magneto. Watching him close on the yacht, Professor X said it anxiously. Stop him how? You said it yourself, Magneto's blind with hate. Brian shrugged and went on watching quietly. Charles, can't you just use your telepathy to make him drop the revenge? Beside Brian, Raven, only now coming down from the afternoon, asked it, puzzled. She knew perfectly well that Professor X's telepathy could change a person's mind without much effort. Making Magneto abandon his revenge would be simple. Raven, I can't do that. It would turn Eric against us. And I'd lose him as a friend. Professor X shook his head, entirely serious. Fine, Charles. Whatever makes you happy. Raven glanced at him, then at Magneto, who had already climbed aboard, and stopped caring about either of them. Brian ignored Professor X too. His eyes stayed on Magneto. You don't often get to watch Magneto take a beating. On the deck of the luxury yacht Victoria, the Hellfire Club's mutants were assembled. To the age of mutants. It's coming. Shaw said it with champagne in his hand. Cheers. The White Queen, Riptide, Azazel and Colonel Hendry, newly of the Hellfire Club, raised their glasses together. Shaw had barely swallowed the champagne when a roar of pure rage and hatred went up across the deck. He froze for a second. Then he saw Magneto standing there in black, holding a solid steel dagger with words engraved along it, blood and honor. Little Eric. Come here, let your teacher give you a proper welcome. Shaw's shock lasted only a moment before his face filled with what looked like genuine delight and relief. Magneto looked back at him, and what was in his face was complicated. Even he had to admit that Shaw was the reason he had become what he was. But Shaw should never have killed his mother. Go to hell. There was nothing in Magneto's face but fury, and no interest whatsoever in reminiscing. He raised a hand, and the steel dagger leapt into the air and shot at Shaw at tremendous speed. Too slow. So slow I can't even summon the interest to move. Watching the dagger come, Shaw frowned faintly, and there was nothing but disappointment in the way he looked at Magneto. Snap. Shaw simply put out a hand and caught it. The dagger's kinetic energy and its magnetic field were absorbed the instant it touched his skin. Little Eric. My proudest student, and you're squandering your ability. It seems the pain I gave you wasn't enough. Shaw turned the dagger over in his fingers and said it with something like regret. Then he reversed it, and let go. Whoosh. The dagger went through Magneto's shoulder and out through his shoulder blade, faster leaving Shaw's hand than it had arrived. Damn you, Shaw. His right arm was bleeding, and Magneto still roared at him like a maddened lion. His hatred for Shaw reached its absolute peak in that moment. And the pain drove his ability upward, fast. Magneto stretched his left hand toward the shore, and every vehicle and shipping container in the port began to shudder violently. Then all of it tore loose into the air, became a torrent of steel, and came down on the yacht's deck in a single furious wave. Tisk, tsk, tsk. He really is a showman. One move, and look at the scene he's made. Miami, third port. Brian settled in as a spectator, watching the fight aboard the yacht with enormous interest. Aboard the yacht. Magneto got slowly to his feet and raised his left hand, and above his head hung the suspended cars and containers. He opened that hand slightly. Every vehicle and container began to come apart. What had been whole a moment ago became a dense cloud of steel fragments. Well done, Eric. Keep going. Across the deck from him, Shaw looked up at the shrapnel hanging overhead and made no attempt to hide his admiration. Shaw. Die. Magneto roared it, and closed his left hand into a fist. The dense steel shrapnel became a torrent, moving like a storm, and swept the entire deck. Facing an area attack on that scale, the Hellfire Club's mutants could not have cared less. Shaw was relaxed enough to pour himself another glass of champagne. The White Queen simply lay back on a sun lounger and went on enjoying the sunset. At the other two corners of the deck, Azazel whistled to himself while trimming his sharpened nails with a knife. And Riptide sat where he was in silence, without so much as glancing at Magneto. Magneto could feel himself being ignored. He pushed his ability harder. The steel torrent, already storm force, accelerated sharply. Fragments beyond counting struck the deck like gunfire. The champagne set out for the celebration shattered, bottle after bottle. The wooden deck was reduced to something unrecognizable. And under all of it, the Hellfire Club's mutants remained entirely calm. Shaw simply stood there and let the shrapnel hit him. Every fragment lost all of its force the instant it touched him, and dropped away. Shaw's mutant ability makes him completely immune to physical attack. The shrapnel wasn't going to injure him. It was going to hand him a great deal of kinetic energy and make him stronger. The White Queen turned her body to diamond and blocked everything coming at her without effort. Azazel became a cloud of red mist and vanished from the deck entirely. And Riptide flicked one hand. The air around him turned instantly into a tornado, and the whole torrent stopped dead against it. When Magneto's assault finally ended, every mutant of the Hellfire Club was entirely unharmed. There was exactly one casualty on that deck. Colonel Hendry, who had joined the Hellfire Club only days before. Shaw. Hendry's dead. The White Queen dropped out of diamond form, walked over to the shredded body, and told him. Then he's dead. We find another contact. Shaw glanced at the corpse without any expression at all, and walked toward Magneto. Come now, Eric. We're where you belong. Join us. Let's build a world with nothing in it but mutants. Shaw crossed the deck to him and made the offer. Shaw. I agree with your ideas. But you killed my mother. There was nothing but fury in Magneto's face. He raised his left hand, and the dagger lying on the deck shot up and drove at Shaw's back. Whoosh! The sharp sound of something cutting the air came from behind Shaw. But faced with the attack from his blind side, Shaw simply raised a hand. The dagger, moving at enormous speed, stopped dead in the air. Then it drifted slowly to the deck. As the only level 5 mutant in the world, Shaw had taken the development of his ability to its ceiling. Absorbing energy at a distance was basic practice for him. Eric. Have I ever actually told you what my mutant ability is? Shaw reached down and pulled Magneto up off the deck, then took a piece of chocolate out of his pocket and set it in the palm of Magneto's left hand. No. Looking at the chocolate in his hand, Magneto could not stop the memories of his childhood surfacing. He looked at Shaw, standing close enough to touch, and the fear buried at the bottom of him answered before he could think about it. So I haven't. Well then. I can absorb energy in any form, convert it into my own, and store it. Which keeps every cell in my body at its peak, permanently. It means I never age. Honestly, if all it did was make me immortal, it would be tremendously dull. What makes it interesting is that I can release what I've stored. Like this. Shaw described his mutant ability almost casually, and then, while Magneto watched in horror, raised his right index finger and tapped him lightly. Every scrap of energy Shaw had absorbed came out through that fingertip, and a blinding sphere of it swallowed Magneto whole. Boom! An enormous blast threw Magneto clean off the deck and into the water. And Shaw had only released the energy he'd taken from Magneto's own steel torrent moments earlier. Even so, the detonation was comparable to a high-explosive grenade. Taking that at point-blank range left Magneto gravely injured and unconscious. He was alive only because he'd seen it coming an instant before it happened and pulled the shrapnel on the deck into a steel shield, which was the sole reason Shaw's energy hadn't killed or crippled him outright. Even so, Magneto's body was in a terrible state. His skin was raw and bloody, and some of the wounds went nearly to the bone. The water around him turned red almost immediately. Eric. On the shore, Professor X watched Magneto, badly hurt, sinking, and could not stay where he was. They had known each other a matter of hours, and Professor X already thought of him as a kindred spirit. And now that friend was in the water, and he had no idea whether he was alive. Professor X went straight past anxious. Ha, he's alive. Thank God. He pressed his right hand to his temple, and his telepathy drove into Magneto's mind. Finding him still conscious, Professor X let out a breath. And then he jumped into the water. Professor X, what are you doing? The sudden move caught Brian, who had been enjoying the show, entirely off guard. Oh, for God's sake, Brian, can you not see that I'm rescuing someone? Professor X struck out toward Magneto, who was sinking, and said it without much patience. There's a good 200 meters between you and Eric. You're planning to swim the whole way? Brian stood on the shore, measured the distance with his eyes, and said it lightly. Damn it, Brian. Either help or get lost. Professor X shouted it back while swimming hard. Look at you. You're rattled. Watching Professor X flounder, Brian was thoroughly enjoying himself. Then he shook out his hands and feet, and dropped into the water. Right. Now we're on my turf. On the harbor shore. Raven stared at Brian in the water with her eyes wide. Is that your ability, Brian? That is incredible. Watching Brian's body change the moment he went under. Raven was stunned, and couldn't stop herself calling out in admiration. Below the glittering surface. Brian had completed his adaptive evolution the instant he entered the water. His teeth had become a shark's, sharp and tapered. Golden scales covered his skin. They were smooth as fish scales and caught the sunlight coming down through the water. And beneath them, muscle was swelling rapidly into something enormously developed. It made Brian look immensely powerful, an 8-pack surfacing across his stomach in the water. The muscle in his arms was more pronounced still. A sharp shark's fin extended from the elbow of each arm. At his shoulders sat 3 fine gill slits, opening and closing, drawing air out of the water for him. Brian looked, at that moment, like a cross between Kisame Hoshigaki from Naruto and DC's Aquaman. And rather than looking absurd, it had a strange, sculpted elegance to it. Brian named this adapted state, Fishman form. Now that he had it, Brian clenched a fist underwater. He could feel the terrifying explosive strength of the evolved body. The golden scales let him feel the smallest change in the current. Fishman form had also optimized his organs and his senses. He could see clearly and speak freely underwater, and hold enough air in his lungs to expel it in bubbles. Brian was, at this point, a newly evolved species. Right. Water is my turf. Feeling the power packed into the body, Brian smiled. Then his feet swept gently, like a tail. Whoosh! Brian knifed through the water like a shark, fast and fluid. As he swam, the golden scales on his skin vibrated faintly, redirecting the current around him and cutting his drag. The water pushed him forward instead of holding him back. Brian became a fast current in his own right. At that speed he was barely more than a thin line drawn through the water. Wow! Professor X, still swimming hard, heard nothing but a rush of water in his ears, and then the wave behind it went straight over him. He fought his way through it and got himself stable again. And then he saw something that stopped him dead. Under the surface, the water had been sliced open as if by a blade, and at the head of that cut was Brian, moving like some kind of water spirit. Good God, is that Brian? Professor X's eyes went wide, and he entirely forgot about the sinking Magneto. Brian paid him no attention at all. He was far too busy enjoying the Fishman form. His speed had already passed the fastest swordfish alive. 280 kilometers an hour. In water, no vessel humans had built could touch him. Excellent. Adaptive evolution really is an Omega-level ability. Brian said it fluently while diving at speed. Having tested what he could do, he twisted slightly, turned hard in the water, and drove toward the sinking Magneto. 200 meters, for Brian as he was now, took no time at all. He looked at Magneto, drowning. Then he opened his mouth and expelled an air bubble 2 meters across in Magneto's direction. It displaced the water around it and closed over Magneto. Tisk, TSK, TSK. Still not dead. Brian sounded almost impressed by the man barely breathing in front of him. Then he took Magneto by the collar in his right hand and swam for the shore at speed. Splash. Within moments Brian had hauled Magneto up onto the shore like a dead dog. Then he put a little force into his right arm. Magneto's body sailed onto the bank and came down hard in front of Raven. The moment he left the water, the bubble around him burst. The force of it dragged Magneto briefly out of unconsciousness. He coughed violently a few times and brought up the water in his lungs. Then he passed out again. Brian, is he all right? Raven looked at Magneto, bloodied and battered, with some concern. Brian's landing had just broken several more of his ribs. He probably won't die. Brian lifted his head out of the water, floating on his back, and said it without much interest. He had used slightly too much force. In fishman form his strength, stamina, and endurance were all enormously increased. His physical strength now could take on 2 Captain Americas. Combined with his speed in the water. A punch from him landed like a torpedo. Brian. Are you certain you're only a level 3 mutant? Professor X, having just reached the shore and checked Magneto's injuries, looked at Brian's current form in astonishment. He had known Brian's ability was formidable. He had not expected this. The instant Brian touched a water environment, his body had evolved into that. And whatever that state was, it was plainly very powerful. However Professor X looked at it, Brian was not a level 3 mutant. You can see it for yourself, Professor. Survival of the fittest evolves my body at random. But because it evolves on its own, it's not under my control. So yes. I really am a level 3. Brian looked back at him and said it perfectly seriously. Professor X had no answer. By the classification system, a level 3 mutant has real combat capability but cannot freely control the ability. And Brian, given the nature of adaptive evolution, genuinely could not control his. He really was a level 3. Brian, we should leave. Professor X stopped dwelling on Brian's level, glanced at Magneto, and said it. Professor X, I'm afraid leaving isn't going to be that simple. Brian turned to look at the yacht. Because on the deck of the Victoria, Shaw was looking back at Brian with open admiration. That young man's ability has no equal. Shaw made no attempt to hide what he thought of it. That's Brian. The White Queen rose from the sun lounger, looked out across the water, and said it. Emma. You know him? Shaw paused, and then asked her. Yes. Emma nodded once. At which Shaw smiled. Excellent, Emma. Go and invite our mutant brother Brian aboard. Shaw had decided to recruit him. But Emma simply shook her head and refused. Under Shaw's questioning look, she said it calmly. Shaw. He's here to kill you. Shaw. Shaw was thoroughly lost. Why would he want to kill me? We've never even met. Brian says you killed his brother. Darwin. Who is Darwin? Shaw was more confused than before. A black man. Just a black man. I've killed enough of them over the years, how am I supposed to know which one was Darwin? Shaw frowned. Now that he knew Darwin had been black, he privately suspected he might well have killed him. Editor's note, the source uses a racial slur 4 times across this exchange. I've kept the beat exactly. Shaw dismisses Darwin by race and assumes he probably did kill him, without reproducing the slur itself. Details in my notes. In that case, Brian can only be an enemy. Shaw's face went cold. Because of his mutant supremacist creed, he was extremely tolerant toward his own kind, and he wanted to unite mutants and build a world with nothing but mutants in it. That did not mean he wouldn't kill one. For mutants who could not be brought into the fold, Shaw had never once shown mercy. Riptide. Azazel. Kill Brian. Aboard the Hellfire Club's yacht. Shaw looked at Brian in the water, then turned to Riptide and gave the order. Riptide. Get him out of the water. Shaw's mutant ability was not the only formidable thing about him. His knowledge ran extremely deep. He had watched Brian's entire transformation. He didn't know what kind of mutant ability was behind it. But Shaw had worked out that the transformation was tied to water. And the best way to handle an ability like that is to take the water away. Riptide said nothing at the order. He walked straight to the edge of the deck. He raised both hands. 2 small tornadoes spun rapidly in his palms. Then he lifted his arms and threw them. Boom. The small tornadoes grew the instant they left his hands. Almost immediately they became 2 enormous ones. They tore across the surface of the water. Water was hauled skyward by the 1,000 tons. Above the sea, 2 colossal vortices swallowed the water and came at Brian fast. Brian looked at them coming and went forward instead of back. He was a level 5 mutant now. And Brian's adaptive evolution didn't adapt to only one extreme environment. He could adapt to several at once. Underwater, Brian gathered force in his legs and pushed off hard. Boom. The violence of it deformed the water beneath his feet into a ring-shaped shockwave. And Brian shot forward. At that speed the water ahead of him rolled aside in 2 directions. Like an invisible blade cutting the sea in half. Driving forward, Brian raised both arms and crossed them into an X. He looked up at the first of the tornadoes bearing down on him. Brian grinned, and his sharp white teeth showed. Good. Let's find out what Fishman Form's upper limit actually is. Brian drew a deep breath, and a stream of bubbles vented from the gills at his shoulders. Then every muscle in his body locked, and he swept his arms outward. Boom. 2 compressed, ultra-high-pressure columns of water shot up out of the sea in an X, thin as wire. The spinning tornado was shredded by them on contact. The cyclone at its core collapsed. And the whole thing came apart in seconds. Bloody hell. Riptide, who almost never spoke, swore out loud at the sight of his first tornado being destroyed. Then he opened both hands. The wind speed and the scale of the second tornado climbed fast. The force of it set the yacht rocking hard on the water. And the column itself grew to tens of meters across. A tornado on that scale can pull a tower block out of the ground. The whole port took a tsunami because of it. Is this what the Hellfire Club can do? On the shore, Professor X watched the tornado rage with a grim expression, and his heart sank. Every mutant in the Hellfire Club was level 4. Brian's mutant ability was powerful, certainly. But could he actually beat Riptide? Brian, you've got this. Where Professor X was worried, Raven had absolute faith. She was certain Brian was going to beat Riptide. Hearing her, Brian, drifting in the water, turned and gave her a reassuring gesture. Then he came up out of the sea and put both feet down on the tsunami. Riding it like a surfer, he drove straight into the tornado. Christ, has Brian lost his mind? Watching him go into it, Professor X couldn't help swearing. But he moved fast for all his cursing. He pressed his right hand to his temple and drove his telepathy at Riptide. He intended to take control of Riptide and use him to pull Brian out of the tornado. But the moment Professor X's power went out, the White Queen felt it from the deck. She put her fingers to her own temple and cut his consciousness off cleanly. Damn it. It's Emma Frost. I can't get through her defenses. I hope Brian can look after himself. Professor X lowered his fingers, defeated. With the White Queen in play, he could not control a single member of the Hellfire Club. Of course, the reverse held too. Emma couldn't control anyone standing near Professor X. They were both level 4 psychics. Neither could touch the other. And while the two of them were locked against each other, Brian, already inside the tornado, began adapting again. He held fishman form. But a sealed aperture appeared in each of his palms. Brian named it, Wind Hole. It was a new organ his body had evolved to fit the situation. And it did exactly one thing. It swallowed hurricanes. The wind hole in his left palm opened. Buzz. A terrifying pull took hold, and the entire tornado went into his palm. The churning sea flattened to glass. On the deck, every mutant of the Hellfire Club stared at Brian in shock. Riptide most of all. He had watched his own tornado get sucked into another man's hand. There was nothing to compare that to. And Shaw was badly shaken as well. He looked at Brian, and the ease went out of his face by degrees. What exactly is this man's ability? Nobody answered him. The White Queen knew what Brian's ability was. She chose not to tell Shaw. Riptide. Use everything you have. Shaw gave the order a second time. Riptide nodded, serious now. Then his whole body began to spin at speed. A tornado larger than either of the first two took shape fast. But faced with something even bigger, Brian simply put out his right hand, and the wind hole pulled. The tornado, for all its violence, went into his palm like a swallow diving home. Plop. Riptide, with nothing left to stand on, spun down into the water. Watching him fall, Brian grinned, and all those sharp teeth made the expression genuinely unsettling. In water, he is the absolute king. Brian was in front of Riptide in seconds, and then, under Riptide's horrified eyes, took him by the head and dragged him down toward the seabed. Riptide. You're going to be the second mutant ability I take. Watching Riptide struggle as he suffocated, Brian used a shark fin to cut his skull open. Then he settled in and examined the brain in front of him, carefully. And at the same time, Brian activated the ability that sees through the operating laws of all things. Once he'd traced the circuitry of Riptide's power, the ability was his. Automatically maxed out. Make tornadoes, can I? Brian tested out the ability he'd just taken, and smiled. On the shore, Professor X looked at the flat, quiet water with worry. He wanted to use telepathy to check on the fight between Brian and Riptide. But he was locked against the White Queen. There was no way to spare any part of his consciousness to look under the water. And it wasn't only Professor X. The White Queen was in exactly the same position. The two of them were evenly matched, and neither could break the other's shield. Which was precisely why Brian had felt safe cutting Riptide's skull open down there. Professor X and the White Queen were the only two people present capable of seeing under the water. And at that moment, both of them were effectively ordinary. Brian wasn't remotely worried about Professor X or the Hellfire Club discovering his secret. On the seabed, Brian looked down at Riptide's body without any particular feeling. He had just taken Riptide's mutant ability. It was a simple enough power. He could create a tornado with a thought. He could also spin his own body at speed to raise an enormous one. Tornado. Brian extended his right index finger, and a miniature tornado formed on it immediately. Compared with what a level 4 mutant could do, Brian's version had been automatically maxed out. It had gone past what a level 5 could manage. A level 5 can only produce one kind of tornado. Brian could produce different tornadoes to suit different environments. Water tornadoes. Lightning tornadoes. Fire tornadoes. Multivortex tornadoes. Others besides. He could even shape a tornado into simple forms. That is the power of the Scylla template. It doesn't only take other people's mutant abilities. It maxes them out on arrival and pushes them to their full potential. And Brian never has to train any of it. He can use it as naturally as moving his own hand. He was more skilled with the power than a level 5 would have been. Having taken Riptide's ability, Brian looked down at the body again. Then he flicked a hand and released a water tornado. Rumble. A vortex formed fast, and a water tornado tens of meters high rose out of the sea. As it came up, the whole surface churned violently again. Brian glanced at the column, then fed Riptide's body into it. Whoosh! The water carried the body rapidly upward. Like riding a vortex elevator. Within moments Riptide had risen to the top of the water tornado. On the shore and on the deck, Professor X and Shaw saw the waterspout rise at the same moment. And they saw a Riptide at the center of it, spinning fast with the vortex. That's Riptide. Professor X and Shaw recognized the figure simultaneously. But with the curtain of water in the way. Neither of them realized that Riptide was already a corpse. Well done, Riptide. Shaw looked at him inside the waterspout and couldn't help shouting it. What happened next left Shaw thoroughly confused. Under everyone's eyes, the waterspout began to move away at high speed, and within a blink there was no sign of it at all. Shaw. Whoosh. While Shaw was still puzzling over it, a column of water shot up from the seabed and gave chase to the vanished waterspout. But after a few hundred meters the column stopped and came back toward the shore. Brian's figure surfaced inside it. Oh, for God's sake. He got away. Brian shouted it with real irritation on his face, and under the water, closed his right hand slightly. The waterspout, long out of sight by now, erupted with countless small whirlwinds, and they tore Riptide's body apart inside it. Then the waterspout sank, carrying the blood and the pieces down with it. Riptide's body left no trace at all. A level 4 mutant, Riptide, escaped. Professor X's eyes went wide, plainly surprised. Brian nodded. Shaw, who had been watching Brian closely, clearly heard all of it. His face, already dark, went darker. Useless. Shaw said it coldly. He didn't doubt a word of it. Because he had just watched Riptide use his ability to flee at high speed. He had been puzzled a moment ago as to why Riptide would run. Now it seemed obvious. Brian must have beaten him badly enough to panic him. At no point did Shaw consider that Riptide might be dead. He knew exactly how strong Riptide was. Level 4 mutants are rare, and every one of them is hard to kill. Emma. We're going back. Losing a member of the Hellfire Club had taken all Shaw's appetite for the fight. More than the next round, what he wanted now was to find the runaway. Every level 4 mutant is a scarce asset for the Hellfire Club. At Shaw's order, the White Queen nodded and whistled once. A cloud of red mist appeared on the deck instantly. Azazel. Azazel. Get the boat moving. Shaw gave him the order. He could have had Azazel teleport all of them away, of course. But how would that be any different from running? As a level 5 mutant, Shaw was certainly not going to flee a harbor on Brian's account. Azazel teleported to the bridge and started the yacht without fuss. But while Shaw wanted to leave, Brian had no intention of letting him. Adaptive evolution had made him unafraid of dying. He couldn't kill Shaw. Equally, Shaw couldn't kill him. With Riptide dead, the Hellfire Club had lost a serious amount of strength. Which did not suit Brian at all. So he intended to strengthen Shaw. Right now. Make him understand the threat that Brian and the others represented. So that he would go out and recruit powerful mutants of his own, and build the Hellfire Club back up. And facing a stronger Hellfire Club, Professor X would have no choice but to recruit harder himself, and build a stronger X-Men. As the saying goes, when the snipe and the clam fight, the fisherman profits. And Brian was the fisherman. Or rather, the fishman, with his hands on everything. Shaw. You think you're leaving that easily? You killed my brother Darwin. I want you to know what it feels like to lose a mutant brother of your own. Brian roared it across the water at Shaw, and then dived hard. Brian, don't let hatred blind you. Watching Brian drive suddenly at the yacht, Professor X had time for the warning and nothing else. Whoosh! Brian closed on the yacht at 200 kilometers an hour. At the moment of impact his muscle and bone swelled rapidly. He clenched his right fist and threw the punch. Boom! Extreme speed, combined with strength past what a human body can produce, makes Brian's punch the equivalent of a torpedo. The enormous yacht exploded on the spot. And then it came apart. The blast swept the length of the ship. Shaw, who took the worst of it, spread his hands with no expression on his face at all. The energy of the explosion compressed rapidly into his palms and his body absorbed it. But Shaw could absorb energy. He could not stop the yacht from breaking up and going down. Watching it start to sink beneath him, Shaw glanced at Brian, and whistled. Azazel turned instantly to red mist, took hold of Shaw and the White Queen, and got them off the ship. Boom! Miami, third port. The Hellfire Club's yacht, the Victoria. Under Brian's attack it broke apart and went down fast. Before it went under, Azazel took Shaw and the White Queen and teleported them to the shore. The instant the three of them appeared, Professor X went rigid. The distance between the two groups was far too small. Under 10 meters. The color drained out of Professor X's face. Raven. Get Eric out of here. Professor X put his right hand to his temple and passed the warning back to her. Raven moved immediately, pulling Magneto away from Shaw and the others. Seeing Professor X, Shaw frowned slightly. Shaw had known for some time that Professor X was also a level 4 psychic. Which made him deeply wary of the man. His physical immunity, after all, is maxed out. His mental resistance is roughly that of an ordinary person. The White Queen could block a telepathic intrusion and keep him safe from psychic damage, certainly. But Shaw knew perfectly well that Emma could not be at his side every hour of every day. It seems that after this, I'll be paying a visit to the Soviet Union. Shaw studied Professor X for a long moment, then gave Azazel his order. Red Devil. Kill them. As the most powerful level 5 mutant in the world. Shaw was arrogant. He considered it beneath him to move against a mere level 4. That had been true of Brian earlier. It was true of Professor X now. Yes, Shaw. Azazel gave him a courteous bow, and his whole body became red mist. When he reappeared, he was standing beside Professor X, bloody hell. Before Professor X could react, Azazel had him by the arm. Then the two of them turned to red mist and were gone. 10,000 meters up. Azazel reappeared in the cloud layer with Professor X. And moved to let go of him and drop him. But before Azazel could do anything, Professor X suddenly felt the White Queen's psychic shield vanish. Which sent him from despair to elation in an instant. He was clearly outside Emma's telepathic range. With the shield gone, Professor X could finally use his power freely. He didn't hesitate for a second. He drove his telepathy straight into Azazel's mind. The cold went out of Azazel's eyes and left them blank. Take me back. Professor X gave the order. Swish. Azazel could not resist him at all, and took Professor X back down from 10,000 meters. Professor X's real strength showed itself clearly in that moment. Bzzzt. The instant they returned, a sharp pain went through Professor X's head. And then a psychic force cut across his control of Azazel. Emma Frost. Professor X looked across at the White Queen, thoroughly unwilling to accept it. He was extremely annoyed with himself. His excitement had made him forget Emma existed. Which meant his moment of triumph had lasted exactly 1 second. His power was cancelled out again. Mind control. Azazel came back to himself and got away from Professor X's invisible alarm. Psychic mutants are without question the most difficult kind to deal with. They can influence a mind quietly, rewrite a person's thoughts, and toy with someone's brain at will. The reason Azazel had joined the Hellfire Club in the first place was that Emma, newly made White Queen, had used her power to teach him a lesson. She had left a psychic imprint in his brain while she was at it. Whenever Emma whistles, that imprint activates. And wherever Azazel happens to be, he returns to her as fast as he can. Which is why Azazel is afraid of psychics all the way to his bones. He gave up on Professor X entirely. His eyes moved, and settled on Raven in the distance. Damn it, Raven, look out. Professor X couldn't use his power, but he read Azazel's intention immediately. His face went white and he sent the warning to her at once. But before it had finished arriving, Azazel appeared in front of Raven, teleported to 10,000 meters, and let go. Whoosh! Raven dropped instantly. Brian! Help me! The weightlessness terrified her so badly she couldn't hold a transformation, and reverted to her blue form. At the moment it mattered, Raven was not thinking about Professor X. She was thinking about Brian. Brian had replaced him completely. Blue skin. Now that's a rare thing. Don't worry, that mutant of yours, Brian, will be right behind you. 10,000 meters up, Azazel looked at Raven's blue skin with some surprise, then became red mist again and vanished. Swish. He reappeared underwater, directly in front of Brian. With Azazel that close, Brian made no attempt to resist. He let himself be taken. The two of them turned to red mist and reappeared at 10,000 meters. Out of the water, Brian's fishman form regressed quickly and vanished. He was human again. So, out of the water, you're nothing but something to be slaughtered. Azazel took in the sight and sneered. Is that so? Brian looked back at him coldly, then looked down. Raven was still falling. Listening to her terrified voice calling for him, Brian stopped wasting time. Under Azazel's astonished eyes, he applied a little force, broke free of the grip, and dropped into free fall. In that much of a hurry to die? Azazel stood there for a moment, then teleported back to Shaw's side. Shaw! The fight's over. Azazel brushed non-existent dust off himself and said it with confidence. As far as he was concerned, a fall from 10,000 meters settles the matter. However astonishing the man's mutant ability, it wasn't going to help. But at Azazel's confident report, Shaw simply looked up at the sky with his mouth slightly open. Shaw was, plainly, stunned. And the only person capable of stunning a level 5 mutant was Brian. 10,000 meters up. Brian fell, gathering speed with gravity. And that violent weightlessness is an extreme environment too. Which set his body adapting instantly. But this time Brian did not evolve anything like a cat's paw pads. This was 10,000 meters. Paw pads were not going to be much use. So this time Brian evolved something else entirely. Falling, Brian felt a faint itch across his back, and then two wings, 10 meters across, tore free of him. They were covered in white feathers. With the wings out, Brian spread them and held position at 10,000 meters. Under the gold of the sun, the white wings looked like they'd wrapped him in holy light. Spread wide, the white feathers gave off a golden radiance. His body had been refined in the process of evolving too. And on his forehead sat a golden vertical slit pupil. The effect was majestic. Righteous, even. Like an angel come down into the world. Brian turned his head, took in the wings, and named the form in front of him, Angel Form. Boom. Brian beat the wings once, rolled, and dived. One light beat of those wings and Brian broke the sound barrier. Within seconds he had caught the falling Raven. Then, while she stared at him, he simply gathered her into his arms. Brian, you really are my guardian angel. Looking at him, Raven wept with relief. Whoosh! 10,000 meters up. Brian held Raven and hovered above the cloud layer. The wings behind him stretched out to either side, and the white feathers blazed in the sunset. The golden vertical slit pupil between his brows made him look, at that moment, like a genuine angel. "Brian, you really are my guardian angel." In his arms, Raven looked up at him, dazzled, and couldn't help saying it. It wasn't the first time she'd said it. Ever since Brian grew wings and pulled her out of a 10,000-meter fall, Raven had thought of him as her guardian angel at a level below conscious thought. Brian's place in her heart had gone past Professor X's. "Come on, Raven. I'll take you down." Brian looked down at her, and then beat the wings hard. Boom! A sonic boom went off across the sky. Brian's flight speed had reached Mach 1. From the ground he looked like a supersonic fighter coming down. "He's fast." On the ground, Shaw looked up at him. Seeing Brian go supersonic surprised even him. And Azazel, beside him, drew a sharp breath. Brian was simply too fast. Fast enough that even with teleportation, Azazel couldn't track him. "That's Brian." The White Queen shifted her attention off Professor X and onto Brian, and looking at him coming down like an angel descending, she couldn't help being impressed. Swish! Brian descended 10,000 meters in a little over 10 seconds. 2 meters from the ground his wings gave a faint shudder. And his body simply stopped in the air. "Raven. Stay with Professor X." Brian set her down and gave the instruction. "All right, Brian." Raven landed steadily, nodded, and went quickly to Professor X. As for the gravely injured and unconscious Magneto, both Professor X and the Hellfire Club had by now elected to forget he existed. In the air, Brian glanced at Professor X. He wasn't counting on the man to protect Raven. With the White Queen in play, Professor X was the single most useless person in this fight. Once Raven had reached him, Brian beat his wings lightly. A violent gust swept down at once. And then the gust became an enormous tornado, closing over Professor X and Raven. A tornado? Looking at the pair sealed inside it, Shaw and Azazel exchanged a glance. They know tornadoes very well. Because their own brother-in-arms, Riptide, makes them. And now Brian was using the same ability. Of course they were surprised. "You have got to be kidding me. How do you have Riptide's power?" Azazel glared up at him and demanded it. "You think Riptide is the only man alive who can make a tornado?" Brian looked down at him with contempt written across his face. Then he beat his wings, and 2 more enormous tornadoes rose off the ground. Whoosh! Whoosh! Both of them swept at Azazel fast. Even several meters out, Azazel could feel the tearing force coming off them. Damn it! Azazel didn't dare hold his ground. His body became a cloud of red mist and he teleported clear. He had barely finished arriving before another tornado came at him. Damn it! He swore and teleported again. But every time he finished a jump, a tornado was waiting in front of him. Damn it, I've got it. Your wings make the tornadoes. After enough jumps, Azazel began to work Brian's ability out. He'd noticed that Brian beat his wings every time a tornado appeared in front of him. Clearly the wings produced them. Not entirely stupid, then. Brian looked down at him coldly and said it low. The wings Brian had evolved could not, of course, create tornadoes. He was simply dressing up the ability he'd taken from Riptide as a function of his angel wings. Wings can raise a strong wind. Raising a tornado follows naturally enough. Oh, please. You think a tornado is going to protect them? Azazel teleported clear again and looked at Brian with open provocation. Swish. He jumped once more, and when he reappeared he was standing in front of Professor X and Raven. A wall of tornado means nothing to a man who teleports. Straight into the net. Brian looked coldly at Azazel, only just emerged from the red mist. He didn't hesitate at all. The wings spread, and white feathers poured down like blades. Like a storm breaking. In an instant they filled the center of the vortex. And at the same moment a second tornado split off from the first and swallowed Professor X and Raven into itself. Thank. The sound of feathers going through flesh. Azazel had no time to react at all, and the feathers left him riddled like a hedgehog. A trap. Azazel was covered in blood. Pierced through as he was, his demonic physiology gave him a tenacious hold on life. Gravely wounded, he could still move freely. Idiot. Brian looked at him and sneered. Azazel's teleportation genuinely has no counter. Nobody can restrict it. Not even Brian. But being unable to restrict it doesn't mean the man can't be caught. After using the tornadoes to force Azazel into jumping over and over, Brian had found his weakness. Which is this: in the moment the red mist has not yet dispersed and Azazel has just arrived, he cannot jump again. Only once the mist clears completely can he teleport. The window is very short. Brian had taken it precisely. Swish. Azazel's face was twisted with pain, and he looked like a demon in truth. He got unsteadily to his feet, and the red mist rose off him again. Then Azazel appeared in front of Brian, and the claws on both hands and the barbed tail drove at him. Faced with that, Brian simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Bone deep. Every feather buried in Azazel's body seemed to come alive, and burrowed deeper into flesh and bone. Then they nailed themselves hard into the bone. The pain took all the strength out of him and he howled. Brian snapped his fingers again. The feathers, blade sharp a moment before, went completely soft. And the bone-deep agony receded like a tide. What did you do to me? Azazel stared at him in horror. The pain had gone right through to the bone. His question went unanswered. Brian snapped his fingers again, and Azazel howled again. Dozens of times in a row. By the end of it, Brian had left Azazel with a lasting terror of him. He swore to himself that from now on, if he saw Brian, he would go the other way. The man was simply a demon. He had a spell out of hell. Having thoroughly broken him, Brian took hold of Azazel, climbed at speed, and brought him back up to 10,000 meters. Azazel. There's no future for you following Shaw. Follow me instead. Brian made his offer.
Hello, everyone. As we wrap up this video, I want to share a quick note. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like to support me and enjoy on-demand audiobooks, you can become a Patreon member. Alternatively, you can check out my Google Drive link, which has 500+ novel audiobooks available through my Ko-fi or Patreon shop. I appreciate your support.